The chilly October morning of 2018 began with an unusual commotion on Old Creek Road in the suburbs of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. 6 unmarked police cars quietly pulled up in front of a modest wooden house nestled on the edge of Susquehannock Forest. The few neighbors in the area peeked through their curtains as tactical-geared officers fanned out to surround the area in silence. Inside, Frank Harlan, 78 years old, a former Penn Railroad worker, was preparing his morning coffee, a habit he had maintained for over half a century since retiring. A rapid knock sounded at 7:26 a.m. Frank Raymond Harlan, Pennsylvania State Police. "We have a summons for you in connection with the 1963 disappearance of Emily Lytton." The officers later recounted that the old man's hand trembled slightly as he set down his coffee cup, but his face remained strangely calm, as if he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. Late summer 1963 in Lancaster was shrouded in a humid and thick atmosphere, as if the moisture from the entire lowland had been trapped in the late afternoon. On the quiet streets, the smell of rotting wood from old fences mingled with the damp earth after scattered midday showers, creating an indistinct musty scent. Emily Lytton, 15 years old, stepped out of the public library, clutching a few books tightly to her chest. The glass door closed behind her, revealing a small courtyard, scattered with dry leaves and faint golden light spilling from inside. Dusk was falling quickly, but for a girl who had walked this route for years, it was not a concern. Emily's path home was a series of familiar sights: uneven sidewalks, weathered wooden signs, and vast cornfields stretching to the horizon. In Lancaster, cornfields always stood right up to the roadside, as if encroaching on every step, while the sound of trains from the Pennsylvania Railroad line echoed steadily each evening. Sometimes, like an invisible reminder that this small town remained tightly bound to the tracks, stretching far away. Emily walked with steady steps, her head slightly bowed, letting the wind toss a few dark strands of hair clinging to her collar. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle droned long through the air, blending with the rising chorus of insects as daylight faded. A man, living near Conestoga Creek, later recounted that he had seen Emily passing through the open land between 2 rows of trees, where the road began to curve along the water's edge. He only caught a glimpse of her light-colored dress and hurried gait, as if she was trying to cover the stretch before full darkness fell. Then her figure vanished behind the dense trees, and he paid no further attention, thinking there was nothing unusual. As the first streetlights flickered on, the Lytton family began to realize Emily was later than usual. Her mother stood by the living room window, fingers gripping the curtain edge, eyes scanning the road leading home. Her father hurried outside, walking along the roadside, calling Emily's name instinctively, growing more tense with each call. They knocked on neighbors' doors, asking if anyone had seen the girl on her way home. No one knew anything. The Lancaster sky continued to darken, and the familiar streets seemed to grow sparse and unfamiliar. The family followed every small slope, skirting the edges of fields, calling Emily's name into the dim air, hoping for just one response. But every place they checked was empty. When night fully descended, and all signs of hope ended with shaken heads, they returned to their small home, where the rotary phone sat on the table by the living room. With no other choice, Emily's parents picked up the receiver, called the Lancaster police, and reported that their daughter was missing. On the other end of the line, the night shift operator noted every detail in the mother's trembling voice, then immediately transferred the call to the Lancaster Police Department's duty room, where only a few officers remained on watch during the late summer evening. The dispatcher logged the information amid the static crackle of radios mixing with the slow spin of the ceiling fan. A missing person report at this hour was not unprecedented in a small town, but the strained voice on the line made the duty officer understand this was not a case of a teenager staying out overnight. 2 officers were dispatched immediately to the Lytton home, driving through streets now dim under streetlights, where only a few houses still had lights on and tree shadows stretched long across the pavement. As they entered the family's living room, the tension was so thick, it seemed the entire house was holding its breath. The mother sat motionless on the edge of the chair, hands clasped together, while the father paced near the window, continually looking outside, as if expecting Emily to emerge from the darkness. One officer opened his notebook and began recording details: height, clothing, items Emily had with her when leaving the library, and most importantly, the usual route she took on foot. The family outlined the familiar path from the public library, along the quiet residential area, across the small road leading toward Conestoga Creek, then turning through the open land before reaching their street. The officer also asked if Emily had a habit of changing her route or stopping anywhere else on the way home, but the answer remained the same. She always took the exact same path. Every small detail was noted, enough to reconstruct a clear route on the map. Once the basic information was gathered, the two officers stepped onto the porch, exchanging quick words under the yellow light. They agreed to initial search the area within a radius of about 1 to 1.5 miles from the Lytton home, enough to cover the route from the library, the land around Conestoga Creek, and the least lit intersections. A small map was spread on the patrol car's hood, the two officers leaning under flashlight beams, using pencils to mark priority spots. The grassy areas behind residences, the section bordering the Pennsylvania Railroad, and the overgrown trails near the southern creek. One officer radioed for additional units to sweep the eastern area, while the other prepared to walk backward along Emily's usual homeward path. Patrol lights swept across porches, footsteps mingling with radio static, suddenly infusing the quiet neighborhood with an unusual urgency. The Lytton family stood at the door, tense faces following every movement, awaiting even the smallest signal in the night. Lancaster PD wasted no time. The disappearance was logged, the search perimeter established, and the official work began. As the clock approached midnight, the first two Lancaster PD officers split directions to retrace the girl's journey, starting at the public library, the last place Emily was seen before vanishing. The library was still lit when they knocked, and the night staff, a thin middle-aged woman restocking shelves, immediately recognized the name. She said Emily was a regular patron who always left before dark. Today, according to her, Emily stayed longer than usual, but showed no worry or haste. The girl simply borrowed a new book and exited through the front door. The staff also recalled that as she stepped outside, Emily glanced quickly toward the road, as if checking for passing vehicles before crossing the sidewalk. Those details were carefully noted. From the library, the second officer followed the reverse of Emily's usual homeward path, shining his light along the sidewalk, checking every shadowed corner, and venturing into dark stretches where a few residents still lingered on their porches. These people confirmed seeing Emily pass through the neighborhood while it was still dimly light. No one noticed anything unusual, no cries, no arguments, or any other sounds. But nearing the intersection with Conestoga Creek, they encountered the man mentioned in the initial report, the homeowner right by the creek's edge, the last person to see Emily. He leaned on the wooden railing, looking up as police approached. The man said he had no interaction with the girl. He simply saw Emily enter the narrow path between two rows of trees, arms full of books. He clearly remembered it was just as light was fading, and Emily's light dress stood out briefly before disappearing behind a large tree trunk. He saw no one with her, nor any vehicle stopping nearby. The road along Conestoga Creek was rarely busy in the evening, and normally no one would pay mind to a young woman passing by. But now that detail became crucial. Police noted that his position was quite close to the water's edge, meaning his view was unobstructed by foreground trees. Confirming the final sighting point helped narrow Emily's path to a very specific stretch from the library through the residential area, then along the narrow path parallel to the creek before vanishing from sight. The other officer connected the entire route on the map in the patrol car's trunk, marking symbols for each area Emily likely passed, based on matching statements from the library and the creekside witness. They marked the main road, intersections, creekside paths, and open land leading to cornfields, spots where a young woman walking at dusk could easily fall into blind zones. Stepping back from the makeshift map, the lead officer concluded that the basic timeline was established. Emily left the library on her familiar route, last seen on a dimly lit stretch beside Conestoga Creek. With the initial pieces clearer, the probable path Emily took was defined, and Lancaster realized they were facing a disappearance more serious than initially thought. As soon as Emily's final route was clearly mapped and witness statements fully recorded, Lancaster PD shifted from verification to active nighttime search, a response typically reserved when victim risk is deemed high. The first two officers on scene immediately radioed command for more personnel, and soon after, the sounds of additional patrol cars echoed through the residential quiet. Each vehicle stopped in front of the Lytton home, headlights sweeping the slope, casting long shadows of tree rows across the road. From here, a rapid search formed, drawing in awake residents, worried neighbors, and even those who had just heard by word of mouth but were ready to help. Without needing loudspeakers or local TV alerts, in under an hour, nearly 30 people gathered in the small yard beside the Lytton home. A senior officer stood by an open patrol car hood where a paper map was spread under yellow light. He divided the area into sections: the road from library to residences, open land near Conestoga Creek, cornfields along the main route, and low ground with dense trees near the creek access paths. Each group of 3 to 5 people was assigned a section, given flashlights, signal whistles, and instructed to maintain contact via simple signals to avoid nighttime chaos. Participating neighbors weren't just worried for Emily. They knew the area was vaster than daytime appearances. Small trails hidden by tall grass, rough, rarely used roads, and especially the thin woods along Conestoga Creek that grew dangerous at dusk. As the first group entered the residential area, they started by checking every front step, yard, and turn Emily might have taken. Police directed everyone to call Emily's name loudly, moving eastward in waves then fanning into side alleys. A few lit homes opened for backyard checks, where streetlights couldn't reach hidden corners. 2 other officers handled the cornfield area, where night wind blew strong, creating sounds easily mistaken for odd movement. They waded through rows taller than heads, flashlights cutting short beams, pausing at every dip to check footprints or drag marks. Along the field edge, volunteers walked parallel, spaced to cover gaps between them. Though vast, the flat terrain aided spotting traces, yet nothing turned up beyond unclear old footprints. K-9 units arrived sooner than planned. 2 tracking dogs were unleashed along the route from library to creek. They reacted strongly near the turnoff to Conestoga Creek, where the nearby man had seen Emily enter the narrow path. One officer knelt to examine the ground closely, noting fresh soil disturbance in the mud, but not enough to conclude anything. As search groups neared the creek, air grew cooler, darker, damper, moisture beading on jackets. The water wasn't deep, but flowed steadily, and 2 volunteers on the bank swept lights across the surface, hoping for floating or lodged items. Nothing but drifting leaves. Another group followed the dirt path along the creek, where thick vines clung to fences, creating hard-to-see shadows. They stopped at any broken branches or disturbed soil, tapping hollow trunks for echoes. All silent. Calls for Emily echoed steadily from afar, reverberating through grassland gaps and trees along the water. Some neighbors scanned low bushes where small animals frequented at night, but no signs Emily had passed after the last witness sighting. The search was organized, areas marked off, teams required to return to start for confirmation nothing missed. Lancaster PD reports stressed every patch of ground, every shadow thoroughly checked, as one small trace could shift the entire investigation. But after hours, no response came beyond wind, through corn and steady creek lapping rocks. As the initial search force completed the first sweep, they regrouped without new clues, everything as unclear as the start. In the patrol headlights cutting through ground mist, the scene commander decided the night could not end yet. The Pennsylvania Railroad line, cutting through the southern residential area and lying directly on Emily's final known route, was identified as the next area to search, not only because it was close to where the girl was last seen, but also because it was a complex region with many hidden spots where even a minor incident could cause traces to disappear completely. As the initial teams gradually withdrew from the creek and meadow areas, a new search group was deployed along the railway tracks, where the sound of metal had once rung out long into the night, echoing even in the vague testimony of witnesses near Conestoga Creek. As the officers approached the railroad, light from their flashlights shone on the rusted rails, reflecting into thin streaks of light stretching across the ground. This was an area not easy to search at night. On both sides of the tracks were tall bushes, irregular mounds of earth, and many sections with wooden bridges or small culverts running underneath. The search team split into pairs, each pair responsible for a segment several hundred meters long, checking north to south, and then back again to ensure nothing was missed. The wooden ties lay close together, making a clunking sound under the officers' feet as they walked slowly, eyes never leaving the ground, looking for anything that might relate to Emily. A small item, a torn piece of fabric, footprints, or even just disturbed soil. Near the area, with a small pedestrian overpass, the officers used lights to thoroughly scan both above and below, checking for signs of slipping or getting caught on any metal beams. One officer bent close to the ground, where it seemed softer than other sections, using gloved hands to brush aside dry leaves, but aside from a few crushed blades of grass, there was no sign that anyone had fallen or been dragged there. They continued deeper, to the area where the tracks curved slightly and ran close to a sparse wooded section. Here, there was a narrow trail running parallel to the tracks, often used by locals to quickly cross town or take a shortcut to the nearby small commercial area. One group of officers decided to follow this trail, stepping carefully over the mixed dirt and gravel. The path was narrow, flanked by wild vegetation, and under the flashlight beams, everything became interlocking patches of shadow. One officer noticed a few lightly disturbed patches of soil, but upon closer inspection, they appeared to be made by small animals or just natural erosion after rain. From the trail, they could clearly see the high embankment running parallel to the tracks, where moonlight faintly reflected on low grass. They stopped at various points to check small crevices and gaps under tree roots, but found nothing indicating Emily had passed through here. Returning to the main tracks, the second group had reached the underside of an old stone bridge, a structure nearly a century old, covered in moss, and whose echoing sounds when trains passed often gave people chills. Beneath it was a damp area with soft soil and many boulders. The officers crouched down, carefully illuminating every patch of ground there. If someone had fallen or been pulled in here, it might leave recognizable traces, but aside from a few wet leaves stuck to rocks and mud, there was nothing noteworthy. One officer cautiously shone light into crevices between large boulders, checking if anything was lodged inside. All were empty. They continued a few hundred meters further south, where the tracks intersected a large concrete drainage culvert. Some accidents in other towns had occurred near similar culverts, so the lead officer ordered a thorough check. 2 officers lay down, shining lights deep into the long pipe, but saw nothing except a thin stream of water flowing through and the echoing sounds of teammates' footsteps behind. Near the access to the culvert, the ground had some strange indentations, but upon closer examination, they were just old tire tracks from railway maintenance vehicles. The team marked them in the report, but quickly determined they were unrelated to the disappearance. As the search continued, they noted one clear thing. This railway line showed no signs of disturbance on the evening Emily vanished. The grass along the edges was intact. Low bushes had no fresh breaks, and muddy soil bore no footprints or drag marks. Nevertheless, they searched once more in the opposite direction, rescanning previously covered areas, carefully sweeping the ground outside the tracks to ensure no detail was overlooked. But the result remained the same. The Pennsylvania Railroad, despite stretching through many hidden sections and overgrown side paths, left no trace that could help clarify Emily's disappearance. When the sweep was completed without any new discoveries, the field commander decided to shift the search to Conestoga Creek, the area assessed as having the highest probability in the vicinity. This was also where the last witness confirmed seeing Emily pass by on the evening she vanished. The terrain around the creek was rugged, with wet mud and many deep depressions posing slip risks, while the steady flow of water could easily erase any traces if an incident occurred. As the search party left the railway and headed toward the creek, flashlight beams grew dimmer due to a thin mist beginning to drift down from the water surface. Conestoga Creek at night had an unusual stillness. The water was not deep but flowed quickly, reflecting light in flickering ribbons. The banks were patches of soft soil interspersed with pebbles and exposed roots like natural hooks. The search team divided into two groups, one following the western bank in the direction of the flow, the other along the eastern bank to avoid missing anything. They began by carefully scanning the water surface, looking for anything floating in the current or caught under fallen trees crossing it. Two volunteers used long poles to probe deeper sections, gently pressing into the bottom to check the mud's softness and feel for any unusual obstructions below. The water was ice cold, and each time the poles sank in, there was a soft glug sound, but no hard objects or signs of a human body falling in. Near a bend in the creek where the bank was wider and the ground had many overlapping footprints, one officer knelt down to shine light close to the surface. He noted a few mud streaks disturbed toward the water's edge. However, the shapes were very vague, possibly animal tracks, or from someone walking along the creek at another time. Lacking basis, they were just marked for further checking later. Meanwhile, the group on the western bank reached an area where the ground suddenly dropped lower, as if someone had stepped down and sunk into the mud. One officer used gloved hands to brush aside soft soil, revealing a darker patch than surroundings, but still no clear shoe prints. Since it had rained recently, many natural depressions appeared on the surface, making it hard to distinguish new traces. Along the creek bank were narrow paths where grass grew knee-high and low bushes formed layers, creating shadowed spots when flashlights shone over. One volunteer noticed grass pressed down horizontally, suspecting someone might have passed here on the evening Emily disappeared, but upon closer look, it could just be old footprints from someone crossing the field during the day. They continued into thicker grass, where the ground was so slippery that every step left marks, but that very fact made identifying real traces nearly impossible. At a section with a large rock blocking the flow, two officers checked the crevices, shining lights underneath to see if anything was caught. A dry branch and some natural debris were stuck below, with no signs related to Emily. Everything was searched per standard procedure, observing the water surface, sweeping the banks, probing the bottom with poles, checking every area likely to trap objects. As the Eastern Search Group approached the turnoff described by the witness as where Emily entered, they stopped longer to analyze the ground. The bank there was low and gently sloping, easy for someone to slip down if misstepping in the dark. One officer noticed a long mud scrape, but when shining light close, the scratch lacked any straight line or pattern typical of a human slide. It curved in an unusual arc, more like a branch dragged by strong wind or rising water. Still, the group noted it in the report as it couldn't be fully ruled out. A bit further, there was ground with indentations resembling child footprints, but upon touching the surface, the officer determined the soil there had dried before this evening, meaning the marks couldn't coincide with Emily's passage. Occasionally, soft water sounds made the team instinctively turn, but each time they shone lights there, the water just flowed steadily, carrying no signs. Conestoga Creek maintained its cold, mysterious appearance, as if swallowing all surrounding sounds. Some nearby residents stood on their porches watching the search team work, faces showing clear worry, but no one with new information. As the hour grew late, the initial search team completed sweeping the entire length of the suspected creek segment. They marked each checkpoint with small tape strips tied to branches, ensuring no area was missed. But after hours probing every square meter of the bank, the results remained only ambiguous strange marks without determinable cause or timing. Insufficient to conclude Emily had passed here after vanishing from the witness's sight. Conestoga Creek, despite its many risks and hopes for a breakthrough clue, provided no clear evidence to direct the search toward a more specific hypothesis. When the team officially left the area after hours of fruitless sweeping, the field commander assigned one final task. A group of volunteers would stay to thoroughly check the low southern bank edges, where previous teams' flashlights had difficulty reaching due to thick bushes and low terrain near the water. One volunteer, a middle-aged man living nearby, decided to follow a soft soil bank section hidden behind a fallen tree. He had to lean to avoid vines and branches brushing his face, flashlight in hand sweeping thin beams over the water. Just a few steps in, as the light passed over a wet mud patch, he glimpsed something angular, unlike the usual rocks or wood pieces scattered near the bank. He bent down, bringing the light closer to the ground, and recognized a rectangular object with sharp corners, darkened from soaking. When he lifted it with 2 fingers from the mud, soft mud immediately clung to his hand, and the object, a book soaked almost completely, heavy from water. He gently flipped it, and though the cover was warped, faint printed letters on the corner were clear enough for him to recognize it as a public library book. Immediately, he called out loudly to the nearest group, his urgent voice causing 2 officers dozens of meters away to direct their lights toward him. One officer ran over, asking him to hold the book steady to avoid altering the scene. Under stronger light, the book was clear beneath the mud, pages swollen from water, edges curled, spine nearly formless. But despite the condition, no one in the group doubted this was one of the books Emily had carried when leaving the library that afternoon. The officer immediately brought a specialized plastic bag, carefully using tongs to take the book from the volunteer's hand, then placed it inside and sealed it. He noted on the bag the time, location, discoverer's name, and evidence condition at recovery, per standard procedure to avoid future disputes. Another officer took rapid notes in a notebook, while additional lights from behind illuminated the discovery area closely. Coordinates were marked immediately. A simple measuring device was placed on the ground for the most accurate position per the investigation team's map system that night. The officer marked the area with 2 neon tape strips tied to the lowest nearby branches to ensure daytime return would pinpoint the exact spot without confusion with nearby points. They also used flashlights to circle widely around the area, checking for any other items left, a fabric scrap, a cord piece, or traces, showing Emily had stood or knelt nearby. But besides mud streaks blurred by creek water, nothing special. Still, finding the book was significant. It was the first authentic evidence, clear proof Emily had passed this area after leaving the library. Unlike vague mud streaks or easily mistaken soil marks, the book was a specific item belonging to her, found right on the witness-described route. The officers understood discovering a personal item was a major step, especially in determining Emily's exact path before vanishing. The book was carefully stored in a waterproof bag, prepared for transfer to the station for evidence processing. Meanwhile, one officer used a marker to sketch the evidence location on the map in the patrol car trunk. He marked it with a red triangle, adding a brief note, "Library book, completely wet, found on western bank of Conestoga Creek." The others continued sweeping the surrounding area one more time, expanding the check radius a few meters around the discovery point to ensure no related traces were missed. But as before, the area remained silent, except for gentle water lapping the bank and insects buzzing in the night. As the group left the creek bank, they carried the disappearance case's first evidence, a damp book with swollen covers from water, but holding greater value than its appearance. It said Emily had stood here, moved through this area, and could tell them more if analyzed properly. Though not solving the mystery, the book gave them a foothold to continue searching amid Lancaster's still vast night, full of unilluminated shadows. After the damp book was recovered and marked as the first evidence at Conestoga Creek, Lancaster PD moved to the next step in the night search, canvassing all houses along the route from the library to the creek, to gather any statements that could better confirm Emily's travel path and any unusual activity on the evening she vanished. 2 officers handling the residential area began knocking on doors, flashlight beams reflecting off glass panels, as they asked each person about what they had seen that afternoon and evening. Many families were still awake from hearing patrol cars and guessing something bad had happened. Some said they saw Emily pass when it was still light enough to recognize her light-colored shirt, but no one recalled anything unusual. No screams, no arguments, no vehicle stopping suspiciously. They just remembered a teenage girl walking quickly, holding a few books like usual. An elderly woman living at the first turn from the library confirmed she saw a girl in a light-colored top crossing the sidewalk and turning into the small path toward the residential area, but she wasn't sure it was Emily, since she was far away and it was getting dark. Still, this information was recorded, as the description matched library and family statements about Emily's clothing. As police continued to neighboring houses, statements became more scattered. A young man said he heard a vehicle speeding at some undetermined time, but didn't know what kind and didn't see anyone walking nearby. Another said he saw a few figures far down the road, but with weak light, couldn't tell if adults or children. Another group of officers went to the area near the intersection leading down to Conestoga Creek, where streetlights barely reached due to overhanging trees. Here, they met a more important witness than previous, a middle-aged woman living in a house right by the road, who had stood at her window all evening watching her son play on the porch. She said around the time light was fading, she saw a girl in a light-colored top passing this area, walking hurriedly, but with no signs of panic or fleeing. She couldn't confirm it was Emily, but was sure it wasn't an adult. Notably, she remembered the girl not walking on the sidewalk as usual, but close to the road edge, as if avoiding something or trying to walk faster. She saw no one following the girl, nor heard other footsteps. This statement aligned with where the book was found, helping police strengthen the assumption Emily had indeed reached the road section near the creek before vanishing completely. However, when asked if any strange vehicle appeared, the woman just shook her head. She said the road was dark and quiet, with no engine sounds except distant train whistles. As they canvassed a few more houses, statements gradually became useless. Many had slept or not looked out when Emily passed. Some only remembered vehicle headlights sweeping the porch, but couldn't describe the type or direction. No one witnessed any direct incident. No cries for help, no struggles, no one following Emily. The only thing all statements agreed on was the residential area's quietness that evening. A quietness so profound that a girl's disappearance almost seemed incomprehensible. Gradually, police returned to the starting point, carrying a series of information that, while not creating a clear breakthrough, helped narrow the time and space of Emily's last sighting. They had confirmed she followed her usual route, was seen near the intersection and creek area, and there were no signs of public following. However, no one could pinpoint the moment Emily vanished, and the absence of any notable incident made the case even more mysterious, as if she had stepped into the night and been swallowed by Lancaster's shadows without leaving any clear sign behind. When the initial statements from residents around the area were compiled and still failed to provide a clear direction on the events leading to Emily's disappearance, the Lancaster PD shifted focus to the next element that could help broaden the investigative picture: vehicles that appeared within the relevant time and space. In missing persons cases occurring along residential roads, especially in areas with narrow access, like the stretch leading down to Conestoga Creek, the unusual appearance of a truck, pickup, or transport vehicle is sometimes the deciding factor. Therefore, that very night, a group of officers was assigned to review all routes leading into the residential area, noting every vehicle that had appeared according to residents' descriptions. They began by asking each household if anyone had seen a strange vehicle on the evening Emily passed through. Some people remembered seeing car lights sweeping across their windows, but no one was certain what type of vehicle it was. A few said they heard engine sounds echoing, but in a small town where construction trucks, delivery vans, and farm vehicles move around all day, distinguishing an unusual sound was nearly impossible. However, one detail began to emerge more frequently in the statements: a light-colored truck, described differently by each person, but all revolving around two shades: light blue or grayish blue. A man living near the intersection said he saw a truck driving slowly past around dusk, but he couldn't make out the license plate or model because he only glanced at it while closing his barn door. A woman in the house across the street insisted she saw the headlights of a large vehicle shining onto her porch, then heard the engine stop for a few seconds before continuing. But when asked if she saw anyone get out of the vehicle, she just shook her head. Police noted that the time she described coincided with the period when one of the witnesses saw Emily crossing the intersection, though they couldn't determine if the events happened simultaneously or were minutes apart. This was enough to make the officers focus on collecting data related to trucks or pickups operating in the area. They contacted local transport companies, the nearest repair shops, and vehicle owners registered within a few miles of the scene to verify who had been driving that evening. Some owners said they hadn't gone out at that time. Others confirmed they were elsewhere with witnesses. Vehicles with confirmed locations were removed from the suspect list. The remainder, mostly personal trucks owned by some residents or unregistered vehicles in the area, were flagged for further checking. An officer in charge of statistics compiled a list of 3 types of vehicles to monitor: delivery trucks, personal pickups, and light-duty trucks passing through the residential area, but not owned by locals. In this list, the most prominent was the light blue truck mentioned by 3 witnesses, albeit with varying degrees of certainty. One witness described the truck as having a square cab, like an old construction model. Another said it had large headlights and an unusually long body. Though the descriptions didn't match perfectly, police recognized that the only common points were the color and its appearance near the intersection where Emily was last seen before her figure vanished into the dark stretch of road. Lancaster PD also considered the possibility that this truck could be a rail worker's tool transport vehicle or a truck that frequently passed through the area. They checked with the Railroad Management Department, but found no reports of vehicles operating at that time. This made the truck even more noteworthy since it appeared without a clear reason. One officer even suggested that the truck might have turned off its lights or slowed down near the intersection, based on the woman's statement that she heard the engine stop for a few seconds. However, no one heard the sound of a door opening or saw anyone get out, so police couldn't conclude anything definitively. Scouring the side roads near the intersection yielded no additional information. A few tire tracks appeared on a vacant lot, but had been blurred by rain, making it impossible to identify the tread pattern. These tracks could belong to any vehicle, from farm trucks to construction ones. By the end of the night, Lancaster PD had gathered enough statements to place the light blue truck on the list of vehicles of interest, but not enough to consider it evidence of criminal activity. Nevertheless, in a disappearance with no direct witnesses, the appearance of an unidentified vehicle near the time Emily vanished was an important detail to follow up on. They entered the truck into the record, noting the exact location where it was last seen, and flagged it as a potential link, though its role couldn't yet be determined. Although the information obtained wasn't groundbreaking, cataloging and collecting vehicle data helped add another piece to the still hazy picture of that evening, becoming an essential part of the effort to determine what happened to Emily on the road leading down to Conestoga Creek. When the list of vehicles appearing around the time of Emily's disappearance was completed, and the light blue truck emerged as the most notable point of suspicion, Lancaster PD decided to move to the next step: comprehensive interviews with the drivers of recorded vehicles in the relevant area to determine who had clear alibis and who had contradictory statements needing further follow-up. In total, 14 drivers were scheduled to work individually with officers during a long night at the police station, where harsh white lights shone on thick report forms and questions were asked steadily, neither rushed nor allowing anything to be overlooked. The first group consisted of 3 drivers working for local transport companies who had delivery shifts in the area that afternoon. They were asked about their routes, times, stops, and anyone who could confirm their whereabouts at the time Emily was last seen. All had route paperwork, and their statements matched signed delivery times at stores in town. For them, police quickly ruled out involvement. The second group was personal pickup drivers living in the area who often drove in the late afternoon or early evening to haul items, machinery, or pass through the neighborhood. These individuals provided relatively consistent schedules. One went shopping at a grocery store, one visited a friend in the next town, another was repairing a gate at home and hadn't left the area. Some had family members as witnesses, others were confirmed by store cameras. Still, police documented every statement in detail for later comparison. The issue only grew more complicated when they approached the group of drivers with unfixed routes, freelancers, construction workers, or those using vehicles for personal purposes without clear schedules. These statements were often rambling, disjointed, and lacking precision about times, making alibi verification difficult. Some couldn't remember exactly what time they left home. Others said they might have driven past the route near the intersection, but weren't sure of the day. Yet, all those tangled statements didn't draw as much attention as the 14th driver, the only one who made both interviewing officers pause longer than usual when reviewing his words. Frank Harlan, a railroad maintenance worker for the Pennsylvania Railroad, Harlan entered the interview room with a thin build, bony face, and eyes that slightly averted when asked about his route on the evening of Emily's disappearance. Unlike others who answered briefly or confidently about their activities, Harlan was guarded and frequently changed his phrasing when discussing the time he left the worksite. When asked if he had driven through the residential area near Conestoga Creek that evening, Harlan said he didn't remember clearly because he might have stopped by the shed for tools. When the officer asked him to describe his route more specifically, he revised it to say he might have gone straight home after his shift, but wasn't sure about the times. Phrases like, maybe, I think so, not sure anymore, repeated quickly, turning the interview into a series of clear contradictions. The officer in charge probed deeper about the truck Harlan typically used for work. It was an old light blue truck, the color matching descriptions from 3 witnesses near the intersection. When asked if he had driven that truck on the evening of Emily's disappearance, Harlan replied that his truck was usually used during the day, but when pressed on why someone on a night shift wouldn't use it then, he said he wasn't sure if he drove it or not. Each new answer invalidated the previous one, and the inconsistency became even clearer. One officer asked if anyone could verify his whereabouts at that time. Harlan said he thought he was working in an area far from the residential zone, but when asked to provide names of coworkers, he said he didn't remember who was on that shift. The contradictions were recorded quickly and thoroughly. However, interview techniques required officers not to jump to conclusions based on vagueness alone, so they continued questioning to explore whether Harlan had a legitimate reason to pass through the residential area. He said he sometimes took that road as a shortcut home, but wasn't sure if he had that week. When asked why he couldn't remember such simple details, Harlan fell silent, his hands clasped as if trying to think of an answer but failing. The discomfort became more evident when police mentioned witness statements about a light blue truck near the intersection. He immediately denied it, saying he didn't go through there, but then adjusted, or maybe I did, but I don't remember. It was this constant shifting between denial and vague admission that led the officers to note him for further verification. When the interview ended, and the other 13 drivers had been cleared due to clear alibis or objective evidence, Frank Harlan became the only one without consistent answers. His statement wasn't enough to charge or conclude anything, but it was sufficient to make him the name underlined in internal reports. The vagueness about his route, times, and ownership of a truck matching witness descriptions made him the next point to monitor in the investigation of Emily's disappearance, though that night, Lancaster PD still couldn't know if that vagueness stemmed from poor memory, confusion under pressure, or something else harder to explain. After completing the driver interviews and noting the vagueness in Frank Harlan's statement, Lancaster PD continued expanding the search scope, understanding that relying solely on traces in the residential area and along Conestoga Creek wasn't enough to determine what happened to Emily. On a map spread out in the trunk of a patrol car, a large area outside the initial search perimeter began to draw attention. Millersville Forest, a sparse but expansive wooded area not far from Emily's last known route, with many unofficial trails used by locals as shortcuts to southern farms. This wasn't a place Emily frequented, but in missing persons cases, such remote spots often become necessary to scour, especially when surrounding residential areas yield no new signs. As the search team entered the edge of Millersville Forest, the darkness was thicker than on the road, and the wind carried a strong, damp, earthy smell. Flashlight beams cut diagonal paths through the trees, reflecting off rough bark and leaves still holding moisture. 2 canine dogs were given long leashes to scent, sniffing hard at the ground near the entrance before running deeper in the direction of the wind. The canine team moved in 2 lines, with an officer in between using a map to mark the route. Millersville Forest had no clear paths. Small trails were scattered, some leading to open grassy clearings, others looping back to the residential area. Locals who had been there said the forest wasn't dangerous, but its inconsistency made nighttime searching difficult. Deeper in, insect noises drowned out footsteps. The team stopped at every clearing under the canopy to scan for disturbances like broken branches, scuffed soil, or anything belonging to Emily. The forest floor bore many animal tracks, making it hard to distinguish new from old. One officer bent down to check small footprints, but noted they were uniformly round, typical of puppies or wildlife, not human shoes. While the main group was scouring near the forest edge, the 2 canines suddenly changed behavior. They strained on their leashes, heading toward the same spot in the northeast where branches were denser, and began low barking, the trained response for detecting an unusual or human-related scent. Officers immediately directed everyone that way, flashlights converging on the pitch-black area. As they approached, they saw a slightly depressed patch of ground, looking different from the surrounding surface. Dry leaves were scattered, but beneath was darker, slightly damp soil. One officer probed the surface with a long stick, noting the soil's compression felt different. They immediately called the search team leader to assess. The group formed a circle, examining details closely. Some leaves were crushed, the soil appeared compressed by something heavy, and a roughly 3-foot radius area was clearer than surroundings. In the context of searching for a missing person, this was often a significant signal, prompting extra caution. However, when the canine handler directed the dogs to sniff closer to the ground, their response didn't intensify as expected. One sniffed for a few seconds, then lost interest. The other turned away, heading toward another cluster of trees and stopping barking. This made officers reconsider. If the area truly had a human-related scent or buried object, canines said, would typically maintain a stronger reaction. Additionally, under closer flashlight inspection, they noticed slight cracking in the soil around it, the kind that appears after rain as soil contracts, not from digging and refilling. One officer pushed leaves aside and touched the soil, finding it much colder than freshly disturbed earth. These factors led the search team leader to lean toward it being a natural depression in the forest, a common occurrence here, where rotting roots or long-soaked ground could create soft, sunken patches unrelated to human activity. Still, the area was marked with neon ribbon tied to trees and noted in the report for later review. After determining no new traces or human-related scents, the team continued deeper along the assigned route. But the further they went, the clearer it became that Millersville Forest had no canine reactions beyond that depression. No torn clothing, no drag marks, no personal items in the flashlight beams. Wider clearings were thoroughly scanned, and officers probed hollow tree bases with wooden sticks in case someone had sheltered or hidden something. Everything was empty. By the final search loop, they had covered the entire marked area on the map. No spot provided additional signs or hints that Emily had entered Millersville Forest. The canine's brief reaction and loss of trail only added to the list of confusing signals the team handled that long night. Ultimately, they decided not to excavate the depression due to insufficient basis and signs pointing more to a natural phenomenon than human intervention. As they left the forest, they marked the area as completed in the search report, but were fully aware that despite efforts to expand the physical scope, the mystery of Emily's disappearance hadn't advanced much. After concluding the search of the Millersville forest and determining that the area yielded no reliable traces related to Emily, the Lancaster PD shifted focus to another location considered particularly significant in the context of the investigation. The Penn Railroad warehouse complex, where Frank Harlan worked and which was one of the most complex sites in the suspected radius, with numerous vehicles, equipment, and intricate access routes. Previous questioning had revealed that Harlan could not provide a consistent account of his route on the evening Emily disappeared, and the light blue truck he owned matched the description given by witnesses, compelling the police to thoroughly search the entire small industrial site to rule out the possibility that Emily had passed through or been brought there. As the investigation team arrived at the warehouse, the patrol car's headlights swept across the old brick walls stained with machine grease, bringing the dark patches into sharp relief. The area was noticeably quieter than the residential neighborhoods, with only the faint clinking of metal in the wind and the lingering smell of industrial oil from the daytime shift. The Penn Railroad warehouse consisted of 3 main buildings, a tool shed, a repair garage, and a rail supplies storage area, all connected by a wide concrete yard, crisscrossed with old tire tracks. The streetlights in the complex flickered with a yellowish glow, creating irregular patches of light and shadow that made the night even more unpredictable. The officers split into 2 teams, one to check inside the buildings, the other to sweep the outdoor yard and the access points near the tracks. Inside the tool shed, the heavy smell of grease and metal was so strong that those unaccustomed to it had to pause for a few seconds to adjust. Wooden racks lined the walls, packed with old tools covered in layers of dust, indicating many had not been used in a long time. The police systematically shone their flashlights into every corner, looking for clothing, personal items, or anything suggesting someone had been there around the time of Emily's disappearance. All they found were buckets, ropes, rail repair tools, and unrelated small containers. There were no notable disturbances on the concrete floor. Moving to the repair garage, where construction trucks were serviced, the team inspected the floor beneath the vehicles, where engine oil often dripped to form large stains. Several maintenance pits deep enough for a person to stand in were carefully illuminated, in case something had been left behind. But aside from old oil stains and partially ground metal rods, there were no signs of what they were seeking. 2 trucks were parked in the garage, one confirmed as company-owned with clear shift inspection records, the other a personal vehicle belonging to another worker, unrelated to Harlan. Both were checked under the chassis, in the beds, and in the cabs. But nothing belonging to Emily was found. In the outdoor supplies area, numerous steel rails, sandbags, and wooden crates were stacked beside one another, creating narrow gaps that an average person would not notice without crouching close to the ground. One officer used a high-powered flashlight to scan each crevice, but they contained only dry leaves, rotting grass, and miscellaneous debris blown in by the wind. There were no signs of torn fabric, jewelry, or personal items. The narrow paths connecting the warehouse complex to the tracks were also examined, as they could have been used to move a victim out of the residential area without drawing attention. However, these paths were covered in gravel and low grass, with no fresh footprints or drag marks. One officer knelt down to inspect a slight depression in the soil near the warehouse wall, but concluded it was merely the imprint from a heavy crate placed there earlier in the afternoon. 2 K9 units were also brought in to scent the area, as if Emily had been there or brought in. There was a high chance they would react, even minimally. But both dogs showed no particular response. They circled around, sniffed various spots, then quickly lost interest and moved on to other patches of ground. This was a clear indication that the warehouse complex did not carry the recent scent of a stranger, at least not in a way detectable by the working dogs. The investigation team finally checked the small break room for workers, a cramped space with a few lockers, a wooden table, and several coats hanging on hooks. They opened each locker and closely examined every compartment for anything left behind or hastily hidden, but found only workers' personal items, gloves, lunch boxes, water bottles, things entirely ordinary and unrelated. After nearly 2 hours of searching, the Penn Railroad warehouse complex was marked as complete. No physical traces, no canine reactions, no items that could link the site to Emily's disappearance. All the police recorded was a dark, aging industrial area operating to the distinctive rhythm of the railroad industry, but showing no signs that Emily had passed through or been brought there on the evening she vanished. This result temporarily removed the warehouse from the list of priority locations, though Harlan's ambiguous connection continued to be noted in the investigation file as a detail that could not yet be dismissed. Once the search of the Penn Railroad warehouse was completed and yielded no signs suggesting Emily had ever been there, the Lancaster PD returned to the temporary command post with a heavy atmosphere enveloping the entire team. Every key area had been searched: the residential route Emily had taken, Conestoga Creek, where the book was found, the Pennsylvania Railroad line, the Millersville Forest, and now the railroad industrial site where Frank Harlan worked. Yet, after many hours of overnight work, the officers could not connect any clear clues to direct the investigation. They had only one piece of physical evidence: the damp book found near the creek bank. Beyond that, there was no blood, no torn fabric, no distinctive footprints, no signs of a struggle or anything indicating Emily had been restrained by someone. Even the mud marks and disturbances along the creek, or the strange depression in the Millersville Forest, held no conclusive value, as each could be natural or caused by animals. The areas with the greatest potential, under bridges, along tracks, trails, and the industrial site, all produced the same result: nothing. As the team returned to the command center, the maps, now densely marked with symbols, resembled a maze with no exit. Every marked area had been thoroughly examined, yet each point of suspicion led nowhere further. A young officer stood before the map, flipping through his notebook, trying to find any intersection among the statements, but the witness information was too fragmented. Residents had only seen Emily passing by. No one saw anyone following her. No one heard suspicious noises. No one saw the light blue truck stop near Emily, or any interaction. The truck might have simply passed by coincidentally at that moment. Even the three people who described it could not pinpoint the exact time or direction of travel. The interrogation room had yielded nothing beyond Frank Harlan's ambiguity, an irritating vagueness, but not enough to place him in the suspect category. His inconsistent answers could stem from fatigue, poor memory, or the pressure of late-night questioning. Harlan had no suspicious injuries, no dirt stains on his clothing, and his truck in the garage showed no signs of unusual use. The investigation team had to note in the report that there was currently no basis to detain him or formally suspect him. Another officer summarized all the night's findings. Despite searching 3 natural areas, 2 residential zones, and 1 industrial site, they had found no body, no weapon, no personal items beyond the book. This forced the team to confront the reality that the disappearance remained exactly where it started, reminding them that as time passed, the chances of finding the victim alive grew slimmer. A preliminary report was drafted right there in the command patrol vehicle. Unable to determine incident location, no additional evidence discovered, no related vehicle identified, no direct witnesses, no substantiated suspect. The report's concluding line left the group silent for a long while. Initial investigation phase failed to establish a clear direction. That was not something anyone wanted to record, but it was the only truth they could submit to command. Outside, the Lancaster sky began to shift to the pale gray of dawn. The first light illuminated the quiet neighborhood, highlighting the paths the search teams had taken through the night: scattered marking tapes hanging from branches, footprints smeared on lawns, soil lightly disturbed along the creek bank. But all of it proved only one thing: they had searched extensively, yet were no closer to an answer. As the officers packed up temporary equipment to rest before resuming duties the next day, the team leader summed up the situation in one concise but weighty sentence: "We have nothing but a girl who vanished on her way home from the library." And in the early hours following a long night of searching, that admission became the temporary conclusion for the entire force. No direction, no signs of harm, no signs of voluntary departure. Just a strange void where Emily had disappeared without any explanation. When the comprehensive report was completed and the multi-day search efforts produced no progress, the Lancaster PD had to face what no investigative unit wants to admit. The disappearance of Emily Lytton had no new leads to pursue. The officers had searched every accessible area within the suspected radius, taken statements from all potential witnesses, questioned vehicle operators, and examined every location considered likely to hold traces of her. But none led to a conclusion. When a case lacks a body, a weapon, direct witnesses, or sufficient physical evidence, the town's investigative system was forced to make the difficult choice: suspend active investigation. In an internal meeting held at the end of the second week since Emily's disappearance, the lead investigator reported the conclusion that there is no longer reasonable basis to continue large-scale search mobilization, while proposing to transfer the file to inactive missing case status, a file archived and only reopened upon new information. This decision was based not only on the search team's deadlock, but also on the limited resources of the Lancaster PD. They could not continue deploying extensive personnel and time without a reliable lead. When signing off, the unit chief could not hide his disappointment, knowing that cases sent to storage often have low resolution rates later. But procedure required him to follow regulations. Emily's file, containing interrogation transcripts, marked maps, search reports, evidence photos, and scene notes, was compiled into a thick dossier, bound in the characteristic brown cover for missing persons cases. A young officer was assigned to take the file down to the basement storage room, where hundreds of others lay dormant over the years. Opening the metal door released a rush of cool air, carrying the faint, musty scent of old paper. The filing cabinet stretched to the end of the room, each drawer labeled with year, case type, and internal codes. Emily's file, bearing her case number, was placed in the drawer for missing persons cases from the early 1960s, slotted between two other unsolved disappearances. There was no ceremony, no flashing lights, no formal announcement, just the soft click of the metal cabinet lock as the door closed. Upstairs in the hallway, a note was posted on the investigator's bulletin board: Emily Lytton file, temporarily transferred to inactive status, monitor for new reports. For the officers who had worked the case, it was a short but heavy sentence. It confirmed that the girl's disappearance was no longer a top priority, and the file would only be reopened if someone provided new information or additional evidence surfaced. A few days later, as life in Lancaster gradually returned to normal, Emily's disappearance continued to haunt those involved in the search, but there was nothing more anyone could do except wait. On paper, the case officially became a cold case, a file neither closed nor actively pursued. In the dimly lit storage room of the police department, Emily's dossier lay silent among countless unsolved cases, like an unfinished puzzle piece in the town's picture, awaiting a new detail to break the prolonged stillness. Nearly 8 years after Emily Lytton's file was placed in storage and gradually gathered dust over time, the spring of 1971 brought a small but significant change, capable of disrupting the quiet that had enveloped the old filing cabinets of the Lancaster PD. A young detective newly assigned to the investigative unit, David Mercer, just over 20, full of enthusiasm and inclined to review unsolved cases for learning, was tasked with periodically reviewing backlog files. It was a job many other officers found tedious, but for Mercer, it was like turning pages in books never fully read. That afternoon, as he entered the storage room carrying a hot cup of coffee and a new notebook, he planned to note any noteworthy cases for further reference. He ran his hand along the metal drawers, labeled by date, until he reached the row for 1963. A thick brown file labeled Emily Lytton, missing, sat between two other disappearances, as if setting itself apart from its surroundings. Mercer pulled the file out and placed it on the table under the white light. He began reading from the initial reports, the family's call, the primary search radius, route maps, witness statements, and photos of the book found at Conestoga Creek. He read each page slowly, jotting down points that caught his attention. Though the case was old, Mercer could still sense the lingering weight in every line. The lengthy nighttime efforts, the densely marked maps, and the disappointment of finding nothing useful. But it was that very focus that led him to notice something that might have been overlooked before: the statements regarding the light blue truck. In the 1963 interrogation records, 3 unrelated witnesses all mentioned a light blue truck appearing near the intersection around dusk. One said it was driving slowly, one heard the engine stop and then start again, and one described the headlights shining on their porch for a few seconds. All those statements were recorded, but marked insufficient basis, because no one could confirm the exact time, and no one saw the truck stop near Emily. Mercer underlined those sections and read them twice more. He realized that although the timing was imprecise, all 3 statements focused on the same area and the same type of vehicle, the rare point of overlap in a case otherwise fragmented. He continued flipping to the driver interrogations, and the name that made him pause longer than any other was Frank Harlan. Mercer noted Harlan's vague responses: "Doesn't clearly remember the route, might have taken a shortcut, not sure who he was working with," along with the notable coincidence that he owned a light blue truck. Though the file clearly stated there was no physical evidence linking Harlan to the disappearance, the ambiguity in his statements, combined with the witness descriptions, made Mercer feel this was not a detail to dismiss. When he reached the summary report page, the note "insufficient basis to detain this individual" deepened his unease. He understood why, at the time, officers could not proceed further. No body, no traces, no direct witnesses. But from the perspective of a detective new to the case, Mercer saw potential. Untapped the light blue truck. He wrote in his notebook, "Light blue truck," mentioned 3 times in statements. Harlan. No clear alibi. Not pursued further. He then reviewed the search reports around Conestoga Creek and noted that the area near the bank was thoroughly searched, but the connecting routes to the Millersville Forest or the Penn Railroad warehouse were only preliminarily checked, not expanded, because there were no traces at the time to direct teams farther. Mercer paused his pen, leaned back, and wondered if the light blue truck might have taken a route the 1963 search teams never considered. He knew his speculation had no practical investigative value, but what troubled him was the repeated vehicle description in a case with almost no intersections. As he closed the file, the haunting feeling lingered. He knew he lacked authority to reopen the investigation, but he could not ignore what he had seen. Mercer slowly closed the cabinet, noting the file's location and the date reviewed. In the quiet hallway of the Lancaster PD, neon lights reflected on the tiled floor, and for a moment he paused at the storage room door, pondering the persistent question in his mind: why did 3 witnesses all remember a light blue truck, and why was that detail not pursued to the end? Though the file remained silent in its drawer, the doubt of a young detective had placed the first question mark on the long path to what had gone unseen in 1963. By 1980, nearly 17 years after the day Emily Lytton disappeared, no one mentioned that case anymore, except for a few veteran officers who had participated in the initial search or elderly residents who still clearly remembered the shock that spread throughout Lancaster on that summer evening. Emily's file remained quietly in the archives, only opened a few times during the 1970s, when there were reports of runaway juveniles or when new recruits wanted to review old cases for professional study. However, in 1980, when the Lancaster Police Department collaborated with the State Research Lab to re-examine some old evidence using new material analysis techniques, Emily's damp book, the only remaining piece of evidence from the night she went missing, was added to the list of samples needing further analysis. The book, now dry and deformed after nearly 2 decades, was removed from its original nylon bag and placed in a testing tray under strong white light. The old mud had been cleaned off years earlier, but the pages still bore dark brown stains that could not be removed. Fiber analysis techniques at that stage were still rudimentary, but sufficient for researchers to use optical microscopes and light filters to separate and observe tiny fiber fragments adhering to the book cover and between the pages. They began by using specialized tweezers to pick out individual dust particles still lodged between the pages, then placing them on glass slides for viewing under high magnification. Among the dust particles and natural debris, one analyst discovered a very small fabric fiber, so thin it was only clearly visible when light reflected off its surface. The fiber was a pale bluish gray, stuck to the edge of a page near the cover, in the area believed to have had the most exposure to the environment before the book fell into the mud. When the fiber was placed under the microscope, they noticed its surface was unlike that of ordinary clothing fabric. It had a slight twist, synthetic fiber structure, commonly found in industrial materials such as machine wipes, padding in toolboxes, or lining inside old truck cargo beds. Notably, the fiber had a thin, oily sheen that weakly reflected light, suggesting it had once been in contact with some kind of lubricant. An analyst lightly touched the fiber with a microchemical probe to test its reaction, and the sheen exhibited the slippery characteristics of machine oil, the type commonly used in truck engines or industrial equipment. This was not household oil, not passenger car oil, and not farm machinery oil. This result shifted the analysis team's perspective in a very specific direction. This oil was common in light-duty trucks and construction vehicles, often seen in small industrial areas and in railroad maintenance work. A preliminary report was drafted that same day. Material adhering to the book may be fabric fiber from industrial use or truck interior, contaminated with machine oil. When the report reached Lancaster PD, none of the officers still on duty had participated in the original case, but when the file was pulled for comparison, this detail drew particular attention. Because in the list of unexplained elements from 1963, the pale green truck seen near the main intersection was the most suspicious point, though previously there had been no evidence linking it to Emily. Now, the fact that her book contained traces of industrial fabric fiber made that possibility no longer a mere coincidence. The officer in charge of archives at the time noted on the file cover, "Industrial fiber plus machine oil, need to review vehicle list and truck owners." He also flagged the 1963 interrogation page where Frank Harlan was recorded as the owner of the pale green truck and the only driver on the list without a clear alibi. However, since this was only evidence analysis without a way to determine the exact timing or origin of the fiber, Lancaster PD had no grounds to officially reopen the case. In the accompanying comprehensive report from the analysis lab, they also emphasized that the discovery was only investigative support and not sufficient to draw a criminal conclusion. Nevertheless, in the context of a case that had gone cold for nearly 2 decades, the presence of an industrial fabric fiber on Emily's book was seen as the first anomaly that could provide a new investigative direction. Mercer, the young detective who had reviewed the file in 1971 and was still working at the department in 1980, was assigned to re-examine these results. Upon reading the report, he immediately recalled the statements related to the green truck and Harlan's ambiguity. He added to his notebook, "Industrial fiber does not appear randomly. Book fell near creek. Possibility, contact before falling." Though he understood that the case could not be reopened based on a single fiber, the discovery of its origin raised new questions that the 1963 file had never answered. How could Emily's book have picked up truck machine oil industrial fiber while she was simply walking home along her usual route? That question, though small, suddenly made the seemingly dormant case unstable again in the minds of those responsible for maintaining the file. By 1987, when DNA testing technology began to be applied in state forensic laboratories, Lancaster PD received notification that unsolved cases, especially long-term missing persons cases with preserved evidence, could be re-examined under new biological analysis standards. On the list of evidence still in original condition, and potentially containing useful traces, Emily Lytton's book was mentioned once again. Since the 1980 fiber analysis, the book had been stored in the Special Archives vault, among old evidence rarely touched. The discovery of the machine oil-contaminated fibers 7 years earlier had not been enough to reopen the file, but it made this evidence a special candidate when new technology emerged. An internal notice was sent to Lancaster PD from the State Forensic Lab, requesting permission to collect all usable traces on the evidence, including the possible presence of skin cells, hair fibers, or other biological material adhered between the pages. When the book was transferred to the laboratory, the first technician opened the bag wearing nitrile gloves, handling it properly to avoid further contamination. Fluorescent light reflected off the warped paper surface and swollen cover edges, clearly showing the damage caused by time. The technicians gently turned each page with specialized tweezers, checking every folded corner. Among the remaining dust particles, fiber fragments, and mud crumbs, they found a very small hair strand adhered near the book's spine. The hair was not completely intact. The shaft was broken and slightly friable due to age. But the root still had a very short segment sufficient for attempting DNA extraction, using the method being tested in the late 1980s. Finding a hair root on evidence that had been exposed in a creek and stored for many years was considered fortunate. The technician placed the hair in a small glass tube, transferring it to the area for classical enzymatic DNA extraction, which took many hours and often yielded amounts of DNA so small that it was only suitable for limited comparisons. The process required absolute patience because a single wrong step could completely degrade the DNA. When the sample was processed, the analyst began running tests to determine the basic biological characteristics of the sample. The initial results confirmed what they suspected. The DNA sample belonged to a male individual. This immediately made the forensic lab's report noteworthy, since the book was something Emily carried when leaving the library. The presence of male DNA on the book did not automatically prove criminal activity, but it raised questions about the timing and manner in which this hair appeared on the evidence. The forensic lab prepared a detailed report sent back to Lancaster PD, explaining that due to limited DNA technology at the time, they could only determine gender and could not create a full DNA profile for storage in an automated comparison system. The obtained DNA sample was too fragmented to specifically identify or broadly compare with existing criminal samples in storage. However, the report still emphasized that the hair was a valid biological trace, potentially usable for future comparison if technology advanced further. When Lancaster PD received the report, Emily's file was opened once more, and Detective David Mercer, who had reviewed the file in 1971 and later overseen the 1980 evidence analysis, was present at the brief internal meeting to review the new results. He carefully examined the report, paying special attention to the male DNA sample detail and noting on the file cover, "Evidence contains DNA, identity undetermined. Retain for future comparison." He also recalled the statements related to the pale green truck and the machine oil fiber found 7 years earlier. Though no conclusions could be drawn, the presence of a man's DNA on Emily's book added another layer of mystery to this already vague file. The book had been found near the creek bank completely soaked. That made the possibility of the hair falling onto it after the book fell into the water unlikely. If so, the hair likely appeared before the book was dropped or thrown onto the creek bank. But in 1987, Lancaster PD could not build a clear hypothesis based on such a limited DNA sample. When the file was returned to the storage shelf, they understood that this result could not change the case's inactive status, but it became the first biological trace linking the evidence to the presence of another individual besides Emily. And though it could not yet be identified, the existence of male DNA on the book was something no one involved in the initial search could have anticipated. By 1993, DNA technology had made significant advances compared to the late 1980s, and many law enforcement agencies began re-examining old files that had collected DNA but lacked the capability for deep analysis. Lancaster PD, though still a small department in Pennsylvania, participated in this review program, and sent a list of files with unidentified DNA samples to the state lab. Emily Lytton's file was included not because of new leads, but because it contained male DNA collected from the hair root found in the book, a rare biological trace still existing after many years. That DNA sample, too, fragmented for use in 1987, could now be entered into the state's new semi-automated comparison method, allowing matching against DNA samples from individuals with minor convictions, civil records, and some unrelated cases already in storage. Lancaster PD did not expect much. Most missing persons cases lasting over 3 decades yielded no matches due to excessive biological degradation. However, a few weeks after submitting the sample, they received an unexpected notification from the forensic lab. The DNA sample from Emily's book had approximately 60% similarity with DNA in the record of an individual arrested in 1978 for disorderly conduct and minor assault. The name sent back with the report stunned everyone familiar with the case. Frank Harlan, the man interrogated in 1963, the one with vague statements. The owner of the pale green truck, described by 3 witnesses, suddenly reappeared in the file, with a figure that no investigator could ignore. The 60% figure was not confirmatory, but it was high enough to be considered a signal. A potential connection between this individual and the hair sample from the victim's evidence. When the report reached Lancaster, the first to review it was Detective David Mercer, who had followed the file for over 2 decades in various roles and had previously noted both the fiber and DNA from the book. He read the analysis meticulously. The forensic lab explained that 60% compatibility did not mean the hair sample definitely belonged to Harlan. It only showed similarity in some genetic markers between the hair and the 1978 sample, but not enough for definitive identification. The technology at that time was not strong enough to resolve fragmented DNA sections or clearly separate faded alleles. Nevertheless, by the standards of that era, 60% was noteworthy, especially in a case with very few involved individuals. Mercer immediately pulled the 1963 file for comparison. He reread Harlan's interrogation transcript. The "don't clearly remember" might have taken a shortcut, "not sure where I was that evening," along with the detail of the pale green truck he used for railroad work. The inconsistencies, once seen as confusion or poor memory from someone questioned too late at night, could no longer be easily dismissed. Once again, he marked those sections in red pen. But though Mercer personally felt something was off about Harlan, the law did not allow Lancaster PD to use an ambiguous DNA result to launch an official investigation. The forensic lab report clearly stated, "Similarity insufficient to conclude the hair sample belongs to individual Frank Harlan. Cannot rule out coincidence or distant relation." This meant that although the result reactivated many questions, it was still not enough to designate Harlan as a formal suspect or obtain a search warrant for his home. When the investigative unit held an internal meeting to evaluate the report, the unit chief emphasized that they could not act on uncertainty. If current DNA technology could not produce a full profile, any legal action would likely be rejected. But in the meeting atmosphere, what everyone noticed was the long silence after Harlan's name was mentioned. All remembered that he had been interrogated on the very night Emily disappeared, and his answers then were never clear. Mercer proposed adding the DNA result to the file and tagging it for priority reevaluation if technology improved. He said that Harlan's name recurring at 2 points, 1963 and 1978, along with indirect evidence links meant he could no longer be considered unrelated. Nevertheless, the meeting minutes recorded a clear conclusion: insufficient grounds to proceed with new investigation. The police noted the discovery but had no authority or reason to approach Harlan again. No new witnesses, no additional evidence, and the fragmented DNA sample lacked the weight to create a breakthrough. Emily Lytton's file, once again, was returned to its familiar metal cabinet, this time with a new note attached: 1993 DNA. Partial similarity with Frank Harlan's sample. Await technology development. In the dim light of the storage room, the file closed as it had closed many times before. But unlike previous times, this time the file was no longer completely silent. It carried a tiny piece of information, a 60% figure, just enough to evoke the feeling that in this 30-year story, a connecting thread still existed, though not yet fully visible. By 2001, when data storage and administrative record retrieval in public agencies had been digitized at a basic level, the Lancaster Police Department participated in a program to review long-standing cases aimed at rechecking unsolved cases with related evidence still available. Emily Lytton's file, already marked with the partial DNA match to Frank Harlan from the 1993 analysis, was included in the list of cases needing background information review to determine if there were grounds for re-evaluation. At this point, 2 new detectives in the unit, those who had never participated in the case, were assigned to delve deeper into the individuals involved from the initial investigation phase. The name Frank Harlan, which had appeared sporadically in the 1963 file and become prominent again due to the 1993 DNA result, was placed at the top of the list of people needing updated background checks. But instead of focusing on the vague statements that were too old to exploit, they chose a different approach, tracing Harlan's work history in the railroad industry at the exact time of Emily's disappearance to see if personnel records or internal notes from Penn Railroad at that era could provide answers that 1963 investigators could not access. Retrieving employment records from nearly 4 decades earlier was not simple. Penn Railroad had undergone multiple organizational changes, archives had been relocated more than once, and many original documents had been destroyed under automatic policies. But fortunately, from the late 1990s, a portion of old personnel records had been digitized for railroad industry historical research, and it was in this dataset that the detectives found an old timesheet listing Frank Harlan. The writing had faded somewhat, but the dates were still clear. Late August 1963, Harlan was recorded as a track maintenance worker on the night shift, in the crew responsible for the area running through southern Lancaster, overlapping with the boundary where Emily was last seen before disappearing. This information was immediately noted, but the detectives did not stop there. They continued searching the crew's task assignment history. An old report from the 1963 night shift foreman noted that during the week of Emily's disappearance, Harlan's crew was assigned to inspect track conditions in the section intersecting the Lancaster residential area and the turn down to the low forest region near Conestoga Creek, the area that the 1963 search team had swept, but found no significant clues. In the eyes of the 2001 investigators, this was no longer a simple coincidence. It proved that Harlan was not only present in Lancaster that night, but working directly on the route Emily had to pass. The report also clearly recorded the crew's start time. The shift began in the evening, lasting through the night until the next morning. Even more notable, in the timesheet records, there was a mismatched period. Harlan was recorded as leaving his work position for nearly an hour that evening, with a brief note resurvey curve section, temporarily off duty. No document explained why a worker would leave the crew at such a sensitive time, nor was there any entry recording who was with him, or who could confirm his location during that period. When the detectives further researched Penn Railroad procedures from that era, they discovered that railroad maintenance crews often traveled in industrial trucks during shifts, light-duty vehicles with square cabs, painted grayish-green or pale green, exactly matching the description from the 3 1963 witnesses. One of the detectives noted in his notebook, "Pale green truck = maintenance crew vehicle, Harlan the driver, need verification." But when they tried to cross-reference the information, the old records did not specify who drove the truck on that evening shift. The crew driver list only began in 1965. There was no 1963 documentation. However, in a scattered note from the night shift foreman, there was a line, "Harlan, responsible for operating patrol truck." This was not enough to confirm he drove on the night Emily disappeared, but sufficient to prove he had authority to operate the type of vehicle witnesses described. When this information was compiled in an internal report, the detectives concluded that 38 years earlier, investigators had no opportunity to access detailed Penn Railroad personnel records, and thus could not know that Harlan was assigned to work directly in the area Emily passed that evening. No one was at fault. It was just that old documents were scattered and not fully examined. The new information clarified what 1963 investigators could only guess. Harlan was indeed present in Lancaster at the exact time Emily disappeared, and his job allowed him flexible movement between areas later searched by the team. Nevertheless, like the 1993 DNA result, this new data was still insufficient to reopen the investigation under legal standards. It was only background information, not direct evidence. No document confirmed Harlan encountered Emily or passed the exact spot where she was last seen. No witness said they saw him or his truck near the girl, and no evidence, beyond the machine oil fiber and 60% DNA match, could link him to the disappearance. Once again, Lancaster PD recorded all the new points, compiled them into a file appendix, and returned it to the metal cabinet. But in the silent atmosphere of the storage room, as the cabinet door closed, one could sense that the scattered pieces of information were gradually moving toward each other. Though not yet close enough to see the complete picture, they were no longer as far apart as before. By 2005, when map simulation and past scene reconstruction technology became more common in investigative units, the Lancaster PD decided to include the Emily Lytton case in a test group to evaluate whether the new tools could help gain a clearer understanding of the initial phase of the disappearance. The data collected over more than 4 decades, DNA results showing a 60% match with Frank Harlan, employment records indicating he was in the area and had authorization to operate railroad maintenance trucks on the night Emily vanished, had transformed the case from a cold file into one considered with untapped potential. Although there was not enough basis to open a formal investigation, a newly formed task force within the department agreed to take an intermediate step, simulating the routes that a perpetrator, if they had indeed intercepted Emily on her way home, might have used to take her out of the residential area. The goal of the simulation was not to identify a suspect, but to understand the terrain in 1963 and determine which route had the highest likelihood of allowing an abductor to remove the victim from the neighborhood without being noticed. The 1963 Lancaster map was enlarged on screen, and then reconstructed in 3D with roads, tree density, lighting levels, and trail conditions based on town archives and 1960s aerial photographs. The map assessment revealed that the area where Emily was last seen was at the intersection of 3 routes leading out of the residential zone. The first followed a dirt road heading south. The second ran along the old railroad line, connecting directly into a heavily wooded area, and the third cut through a narrow road, leading to a series of farms outside Lancaster. The analysis team began simulating each route under the assumption that the perpetrator used a vehicle matching witness descriptions, a light-duty pale green truck, similar to those used for railroad maintenance. For the first route, the southern dirt road, the simulation showed it was the easiest to travel, reachable in 5-7 minutes after leaving the intersection. The road had virtually no homes, little lighting, and in 1963, 2 sections were still unpaved, significantly muffling engine noise in the damp soil area. However, this route was deemed risky because it led to farm areas with heavy evening traffic, creating a chance of being spotted if the perpetrator moved at the wrong time. The second route, the old railroad line, immediately drew more attention. Based on historical data, this line was primarily used by Penn Railroad for industrial trucks and nighttime maintenance crews. The simulation showed that a light-duty industrial truck could easily travel along it without headlights for most of the distance, thanks to light reflecting off the rails and metal surfaces from passing nighttime trains. Notably, the route had 2 small turnoffs branching from the tracks, one of which led directly to a trail connecting to Susquehannock Forest, a sparse but vast wooded area a few miles from Lancaster, known for numerous logging truck roads and hard-to-track internal paths. The simulation also indicated that the railroad route was a logical choice if the perpetrator wanted to avoid being seen by locals, as the entire section lay below the main road level and was obscured by high embankments and dense vegetation. The third route, the Western Farm Road, received less attention in the 1963 investigation, but when simulated, it revealed some anomalies. This route could allow an abductor to quickly exit Lancaster, but it had many sections with direct sightlines to porches and barns, increasing the risk of detection. Additionally, this path had no direct shortcuts linking to any large forest or remote area suitable for hiding a vehicle or victim. When all three routes were fully reconstructed with travel times, risk levels, and detection avoidance potential, the investigators noticed a striking common factor. Despite different starting points, all three routes could lead to a single forested area, Susquehannock Forest. The first connected indirectly via the southern dirt roads, the second led almost directly to the northern edge of the forest, and the third, though less ideal, could loop down to a county road and into the forest fringe if the perpetrator knew the terrain. The simulation results were documented in the report. All escape routes from Lancaster after Emily's last known location have a reasonable possibility of leading to the Susquehannock area, particularly strong for the railroad route. This drew the analysis team's attention to the fact that Harlan had worked as a railroad employee and had access to the second route, a little-known path that avoided residential eyes and facilitated rapid nighttime movement. The report concluded that if the perpetrator was familiar with the railroad, authorized to operate industrial trucks, and present in the area that night, the most logical route to remove the victim would be along the old railroad line before turning into Susquehannock Forest. Although this was not prosecutable evidence, the 2005 simulation for the first time provided a logically consistent movement pattern aligned with historical data and 1963 witness statements. It was the first time in over 40 years that the case had a clear route structure, a hypothetical framework that could explain how Emily vanished without anyone seeing or hearing anything. By 2010, when Pennsylvania's DNA storage system was upgraded to new standards and expanded to include samples from minor offenses, a small incident in a neighboring county inadvertently pushed the Emily Lytton file one step closer to an answer that had eluded everyone for nearly half a century. Frank Harlan, then over 70 years old, was briefly detained by local police following a minor altercation at a convenience store. Though the offense was minor and did not lead to criminal charges, the state had begun requiring DNA collection for identification from all individuals detained in incidents involving violent behavior. As procedure, a buccal swab from Harlan was taken and entered into the state CODIS system. No one in that small police department knew the name was linked to a 1963 missing person case, nor that this DNA sample would trigger a chain reaction. A few weeks after entry, a high-priority alert was sent to Lancaster PD headquarters. DNA sample from individual Frank Raymond Harlan shows 89% similarity with unidentified DNA sample in the Emily Lytton case 1963. The 89% figure was not a perfect match, but for 2010-era nuclear DNA analysis of mixed samples, which could recover many degraded segments from old evidence, this level of similarity virtually ruled out coincidence. It also far exceeded the 60% that had puzzled investigators in 1993. When the report entered the internal system, the detective assigned to cold cases, who had followed the file since taking over in 2004, immediately reopened all accumulated appendices from decades past, the machine oil-stained industrial fabric fibers on the book, the 1987 male DNA results, the 1993 partial match, the 1963 time cards proving Harlan was in the area where Emily was last seen, and the 2005 simulation showing the railroad route, accessible to Harlan, as the most suitable for undetected removal of the victim. Placing all that data alongside the new report with 89% DNA similarity created a logical picture clearer than ever before. The forensic report explained that the 1963 sample had suffered heavy fragmentation from water, mud, and time, preventing a full modern match. However, when analyzed by probability coefficients, the chance of two unrelated individuals achieving 89% similarity was extremely low. The likelihood that the hair in the book belonged to someone else entirely was virtually zero. During the initial review meeting, detectives focused on whether technical error was possible, but the state lab confirmed the analysis had been repeated 3 times using 2 different comparison methods, with all 3 yielding similarity indices between 87% and 89%, within allowable error for classic degraded DNA samples. One detective asked, could it be a relative of Harlan's? The lab responded that the sample showed no genetic pattern suggesting father-child or sibling relationship. If related, it could only be distant kinship, but no data in the file indicated any other Harlan family member was in Lancaster that day or connected to the railroad. This made the conclusion that the sample belongs to Harlan more credible than at any prior point. The analysis report included the most significant sentence: at 89% similarity, the likelihood that the DNA sample belongs to Frank Harlan is more than 1,800 times greater than the likelihood it belongs to any random individual in the general population. For the detectives, that statement carried the weight of the first time in the case's history that scientific probability linked physical evidence to a specific individual. However, despite the strength of 89%, the detectives remained aware that the law did not allow them to treat it as charging evidence. To reopen the case and seek search or arrest warrants, they needed to prove the DNA was not only suggestive but relevant to the time of the crime. Therefore, the most critical issue at this stage was assessing whether the hair could have entered the book after Emily's disappearance. The forensic lab answered, the possibility of the sample entering after the book fell into the creek is virtually zero. Hair degrades easily in water and mud, but the presence of the root means it adhered to the book surface before water contact. This indirectly confirmed that the man with that DNA had contact with the book before it fell near the creek bank, i.e., before Emily vanished. When all data was combined, the Lancaster PD internal report was written with a concluding sentence that opened a turning point unimaginable for nearly half a century. There is sufficient scientific basis to consider Frank Raymond Harlan the primary potential suspect in the disappearance of Emily Lytton. It was not an accusation, nor enough for an arrest warrant, but it was the first time in the long history of the case that science brought a name closer to the truth than any testimony or speculation. And the moment that report was approved, the Emily Lytton file was no longer purely a cold case. It was inching toward the threshold of reopening after nearly 47 years of silence. In 2018, after the 2010 DNA report was re-examined alongside all data accumulated over more than half a century, the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office decided that the Emily Lytton disappearance no longer belonged in the drawer of cold cases. It now had sufficient scientific, investigative, and historical basis to be reopened as a full criminal investigation. This decision did not occur in a single meeting, but was the result of a months-long review process in which forensic experts, legal advisors, and representatives from multiple investigative units analyzed every data point in the file. When the 89% DNA match was reconfirmed at the end of 2017, all parties agreed that failing to reopen the case would be a serious oversight. Thus, in early February 2018, an official announcement was issued. The Emily Lytton disappearance is undergoing comprehensive reevaluation under the designation Cold Case Priority Review. Accompanying the announcement was the decision to form a task force reporting directly to the Attorney General, responsible for reviewing the entire file, re-interviewing surviving witnesses, locating new documents, and applying modern investigative techniques unavailable to the 1963 force. The appointee as task force leader was Detective Aaron Whitlock, an experienced state detective with over 20 years in violent crime investigations, known for his skill in mining old cases and uncovering overlooked details. Whitlock was not from Lancaster, which proved an advantage. He had no preconceptions, community memories, or local emotional ties to the case, allowing him to approach the investigation with complete objectivity. Upon assignment, Whitlock received the full paper file, remaining physical evidence, copies of forensic reports, and appendices from 1971, 1980, 1993, 2001, and 2005. But the first thing he did was not read, it was assemble the team. He selected 4 core members a historical data analyst, a senior forensic technician, an investigator specializing in interviewing elderly witnesses, and a forensic cartography expert. Each was given clear responsibilities, with the shared goal of reconstructing the entire case from clean foundational data, independent of outdated conclusions, obsolete assumptions, or no longer relevant speculation. The team's first step was digitizing the entire file, a task far more massive than anyone anticipated. The Emily file spanned nearly 6 decades, containing hundreds of pages of handwritten notes, maps marked in red ink, crime scene photos, interrogation transcripts, evidence reports, scattered forensic results from the 1980s to 2010, and countless annotations left by different detectives over the years. Whitlock required everything to be scanned at high resolution, creating a searchable database by keyword, date, geographic location, and name. To ensure accuracy, the team had to categorize every page by year, investigative group, area, and document type. The yellowed 1963 papers even had to be laminated to prevent tearing during scanning. The work took nearly 4 weeks, and when complete, for the first time in the case's history, all its data could be accessed in seconds via a modern search system. Whitlock sat at the screen, opening the 1963 Lancaster map overlaid with digitized layers, vague witness statements, patrol routes, the book's recovery location, the Conestoga Creek area, railroad maintenance crew paths, searched zones, and flagged points, never fully verified. He realized the case had never been approached holistically. Each decade addressed only a fragment before abandoning it. He told the team at the first meeting, "We will treat this case as if it happened yesterday. No assumption is taken as fact." The team began by reconstructing the original timeline. The times Emily left the library, was seen at the intersection, the book fell near the creek bank, and searched areas were plotted on the map in precise sequence. 1963 railroad data was added, along with Harlan's night shift assignments, creating toggleable information layers for comparison. When the cartography specialist used software to recreate the 2005 simulation and overlay it with original data, Whitlock saw that nearly all information pointed back to the 3 core routes identified by the earlier simulation team: the Southern Dirt Road, the old rail line, and the Farm Access Road. But in 2018, with detailed terrain analysis capabilities, they could go deeper, assessing light density, muddy sections, street lamp positions, tree-obscured blind spots, and even wind direction on the evening Emily vanished. An initial team analysis report showed that the railroad route remained the optimal path for any covert movement that evening, and Harlan's authorization to use industrial trucks added consistency to the data. When Whitlock reviewed the forensic findings, he paid special attention to the lab's 2010 statement. The likelihood that the DNA sample belongs to Frank Harlan is more than 1,800 times greater than the likelihood it belongs to any random individual in the population. He highlighted it in red and added a personal note: "This is the primary basis for legalizing reinvestigation." With digitization complete, the team moved to high-level analysis. They used artificial intelligence software to scan the entire file, identifying names appearing more than 3 times across decades, repeatedly marked locations, and especially contradictions between statements and field reports. The result that caught Whitlock's attention most was the unusual repetition of the intersection between the old rail line and the Southern Dirt Road, a point never excavated, never searched with modern equipment, and with no report confirming that the 1963 search teams had accessed it with necessary thoroughness. This became a private note, possible geographic gap in the 1963 investigation. Simultaneously, the interview specialist began compiling a list of surviving witnesses, though few remained, several old neighbors of the family, 2 witnesses who saw the little girl in a light-colored coat, and any former co-workers of Harlan still listed in railroad retirement records. Whitlock knew time had eroded their memories, but any fragment, however small, could connect to the DNA data. By late April 2018, the task force formally submitted its opening report to the Attorney General's office. A fully restructured file, strong scientific conclusions from DNA analysis, and a prioritized list of investigative targets. The report ended with the sentence, "The Emily Lytton case has sufficient legal and scientific basis to proceed with a full investigation as an abduction with undetermined outcome." When the report was approved, the Attorney General signed the official order reopening the file, stamping it active investigation for the first time since 1963. More than half a century after Emily vanished, her case was finally no longer a story buried in the cold storage room. It had become a state-level investigative priority, and Detective Aaron Whitlock and his team were preparing to enter the most difficult phase, uncovering the truth that had been concealed for 55 years. When all the case files had been digitized and the 1963 movement route simulations were completed, Detective Aaron Whitlock decided that the next step could not rely solely on paper records or old witness statements. They had to investigate the terrain by returning to the geographical element, the one that had outlasted any witness or physical evidence. The Susquehannock Forest, where all three 2005 simulation routes converged, became the group's focal point of analysis. But unlike the 1963 search team, Whitlock did not view the forest merely as a vast space to sweep. He saw it as a living geological structure that had changed over more than half a century, and within those changes might be hidden traces that the naked eye could never detect. The state's forensic geology team was brought in, carrying topographic data sets from 1950 to 2018, including soil maps, landslide records, aerial photographs, watershed maps, and data on human interventions, such as digging pits, filling land, logging and forestry road improvements. When these data layers were overlaid on Whitlock's digitized map, the entire Susquehannock Forest appeared as a series of geological layers, with an unusual history of changes, minor landslides, localized sinkholes, altered water flows, trails that had been buried or newly formed. The team decided to focus on the area where the old railroad line intersected the trail leading deep into the forest, where the 2005 simulations indicated the perpetrator could have taken the victim the fastest without being detected. Data from 1964, taken from black and white aerial photos, showed that at a location about 3/4 of a mile from the railroad intersection, there was a small oval-shaped depression, approximately 20 feet long. By 1970, that depression had grown larger, extending eastward as if the soil had been pulled downward by underground water flow. But the 1975 data was what truly made Whitlock's team pause. A report from the Pennsylvania Department of Forestry noted that Susquehannock Forest area, compartment 14B, experienced minor subsidence after heavy rain, proceeded to fill and reinforce with new topsoil. The report included a small map indicating the subsidence location, and when Whitlock compared the coordinates to the team's 3D model, he realized it lay precisely in the overlap of two concealed routes, the railroad and the Southern Trail. The question immediately arose, why would an area only a few feet above the creek level subside right during the 1975 rain event? The geology team suggested the area had unstable soil, but when they overlaid the 1959 soil map, they found that this location originally had solid ground with low subsidence risk. The sudden change raised suspicions that the soil had been disturbed by human activity before the rain impacted it. When examining the 1976 imagery layer, the area appeared unnaturally flat. The ground had not only been filled but also leveled, indicating machinery intervention or at least a large volume of soil being dumped in. The team continued digging deeper into the data in the 1975 forestry vehicle traffic logs. There was something odd. A light-duty truck recorded entering compartment 14B twice on the night the subsidence occurred. Whitlock knew that Susquehannock Forest spanned thousands of acres, but a truck entering the exact subsidence area before forestry workers discovered the anomaly. The next day was something that could not be ignored. Moreover, the vehicle was recorded as a Type B industrial truck, the kind commonly used for rail track repairs, very similar to the vehicles used by the Penn Railroad maintenance crew in the 1960s. The team further analyzed rainwater flow in the area. When simulating the 1975 rainfall on the newly filled soil, the software showed that originally stable ground would not subside quickly unless it had been excavated beforehand. However, if there was a void beneath the soil, like a dug pit or an area previously disturbed and then filled, heavy rain could cause subsidence within hours. The team's geological report concluded. Compartment 14B shows clear signs of excavation prior to the 1975 rain-induced subsidence. The new topsoil layer has significantly lower compaction than surrounding areas. Whitlock sat in front of the screen, staring at the flashing red marker on the analysis map, and he understood that they had found the first geographical location with more significance than any clue from 1963 to the present. He requested the analysis team to check additional forestry data from 1970, 1980 for any unusual activity in compartment 14B, and they found a small but crucial detail in 1976 and 1977. Surrounding areas of compartment 14B were surveyed for thinning or forestry road expansion, but 14B itself was left untouched. Records stated terrain unsuitable, but with no detailed explanation. This led Whitlock to suspect that for 40 years, the area had been unconsciously overlooked, not prioritized for forestry, not on main patrol routes, and rarely disturbed by humans. An ideal spot if someone wanted to hide something without being discovered. When Whitlock presented the analysis results to the team, he reached the conclusion, an area on the route confirmed by the 2005 simulations as logical for the abduction, showing signs of excavation before 1975, leveled after subsidence, and bypassed in subsequent surveys, was too great a coincidence to ignore. Especially since that route fell within the work scope of Frank Harlan, the man whose DNA matched 89% with the sample recovered from Emily's evidence. The forensic geology team proposed conducting subsurface scans using GPR equipment, but Whitlock noted that to proceed, they needed approval from the Attorney General, as the area was on state forestry land. In the summary report to superiors, he wrote, "Geological data indicates unusual activity at Susquehannock, compartment 14B, in 1975. Area likely subjected to prior intervention before subsidence. Recommend designation as priority 1 suspicious areas within the investigation." And as he placed the final period, Whitlock knew that for the first time in over half a century, they had a point on the map, not speculation, not intuition, but a location with scientific basis, abnormal geological history, and logical connection to all the movement routes from the night Emily disappeared. When the geological analysis results showed that compartment 14B of Susquehannock Forest had unusual soil activity in 1975, Detective Aaron Whitlock knew they needed to gather even more historical data to determine whether this area was merely a natural subsidence point or had been human-intervened before heavy rain exposed the underlying structure. He assigned the task to the team's forensic cartography expert, who had worked with hundreds of old Pennsylvania state maps to collect all documents related to logging, forestry road development, soil surveys, and archived records from the Department of Forestry and Penn Railroad from 1963 to 1975. The goal was clear. Find out if the marked location in 14B had ever contained a soil pit, burial pit, excavation pit, or any void before being filled in 1975. Archival research was far from simple. Susquehannock Forest maps from the 1960s, 1970s, were not standardized like modern ones. Many were hand-drawn sketches, pencil notes, with symbolic notations unique to each surveyor. However, after nearly 3 weeks searching the state archives, the team discovered a 1966 forestry map recording small clay extraction pits scattered in the forest for old railroad construction. Pit number 7 on the map, drawn as a small circle with the note clay pit, small overlapped almost exactly with the area the geology team identified as subsiding in 1975. Whitlock immediately requested cross-referencing the 1966 pit location with the 1963 map to see if the pit existed before Emily's disappearance. When the 1963 map was located and enlarged, the team spotted a faint drawing in the exact spot but without notation, just a light blank area amid the dark forest background. This suggested the pit may have existed before 1966, but was not noted on older maps because it hadn't yet been used for extraction. In the 1971 map, the area was marked with a small X, indicating unstable area, and by the 1975 map, it was crossed out by the forestry engineer to mark the subsided and filled zone. When overlaying the three maps from 1963, 1975 on the team's GIS model, something noteworthy emerged. The former pit location nearly matched one of the spots where the K9 unit had a weak reaction in 1963. A detail that had puzzled the search team before being quickly dismissed because the dogs did not sustain the alert long enough to confirm human scent. Whitlock stood looking at the overlaid data model, feeling as if the scattered puzzle pieces from half a century were finally aligning in an order no one had seen before. The K9 reaction, though weak, at the exact former pit site, which then became the 1975 subsidence location before being filled, made the hypothesis of human impact more convincing. But to be certain, the team continued collecting state logging documents from 1968, 1974, for any reports describing digging, filling, or leveling in the area. A 1972 report noted that Forestry Road 14B sustained minor damage due to loose soil, but mentioned no pit filling. The 1974 report showed the area planned for trail expansion, but postponed due to soft soil voids present. The recurring details about soft soil voids, unstable, convinced the analysis team this was no ordinary coincidence. In particular, the 1974 map's list of unusually noted voids had only 3 locations across the entire forest, one of which was 14B. The team's geologist explained, if the area had been dug and then manually filled with soil different from the original, that layer would have low compaction, prone to water erosion and subsidence. This aligned with the 1975 subsidence model the team had previously analyzed, not purely natural, but due to pre-existing soil instability. For further verification, the team accessed the Department of Forestry's aerial photography archives. In the 1964 photo, compartment 14B clearly showed a lighter-colored patch, sign of disturbed soil or freshly exposed earth. By 1970, the area was darker, as if brush had regrown. But in the 1976 photo, right after the subsidence and filling, the area was flat but with uneven soil color, indicating fill from an external source, not natural surrounding soil. One final detail solidified the suspicion. When cross-referencing old maps with railroad maintenance crew reports, the team discovered that the old railroad used for industrial trucks had an unofficial branch leading into compartment 14B in 1963. This branch no longer existed by 1975, overgrown and obscured by subsidence, but in a 1962 hand-drawn worker map, it was marked with a small triangle symbol. This meant someone familiar with the route, especially a night shift worker like Harlan, could easily drive a vehicle into the area at the time of Emily's disappearance. When the map and deforestation document analysis report was complete, Whitlock presented the conclusion to the team compartment 14B was not just a site of unusual 1975 subsidence, but a pre-existing pit on a route matching abduction simulations, overlapping with the 1963 K9 reaction site. All these factors combined showed it was not just an anonymous forest spot, but the most suspicious point in the entire investigation radius, a location that could conceal what everyone searched for in 1963, but never found. On the morning of September 12, 2018, when the comprehensive report combining geological analysis, Susquehannock Forest maps, and all DNA data was finalized by Whitlock, the Attorney General's office signed the decision authorizing the formal summons of Frank Raymond Harlan for questioning as a person of interest, someone directly linked to an ongoing reopened criminal investigation. Harlan was then 78 years old. living alone in a small log house on the outskirts of York County, where he had moved in the late 1980s. His health had declined, his gait slightly stooped, but records still noted, capable of independent movement, no full-time medical care required. The summons was served at 9:15 a.m. Two investigators, with proper paperwork, knocked on his door, clearly stating it was not an arrest warrant, but he was required to appear for questioning related to the 1963 disappearance. Harlan took the summons paper with slightly trembling hands, but his expression was almost blank. He did not ask why, did not protest, only said one short sentence, "It's been nearly 60 years. What more do you want from me?" No one answered. He was escorted to the vehicle, slowly, stepping carefully, as if trying to regain balance in a reality he thought he had buried long ago. Upon arriving at Lancaster PD headquarters, Harlan was led into Interrogation Room 3, a small room with pale gray walls, an old wooden table, and two metal chairs. A high-angle camera recorded everything. Detective Aaron Whitlock entered, placing a thick case file folder on the table. He did not sit immediately, instead looking at Harlan for a few seconds, as if assessing whether the man across from him fully grasped the gravity of the session. "Mr. Harlan," Whitlock began, his voice calm but icy sharp, "I'm here to revisit the questions you answered on the night of August 30th, 1963. But today, we have much more data. Every answer you give will be compared against new evidence." Harlan furrowed his brow, squinting slightly. "I already said everything. I don't remember much." "Then let me help you remember," Whitlock said, pulling the folder closer and opening to the first page, a copy of Harlan's 1963 statement, a yellowed sheet, his signature faded but recognizable. "In 1963, you said you didn't clearly remember what you did that evening. You said you might have been in the Southern Rail area, or might have been at the depot. You had no clear alibi. You also denied driving a truck that night." Harlan glanced at the page, but said nothing. Whitlock continued. "In 2001, railroad records were digitized. We found the work assignment logs. You were recorded as present in Lancaster. On night shift, right in the area, Emily Lytton passed through. Would you like to explain why your 1963 statement completely contradicts the personnel records?" Harlan closed his eyes for a second, exhaling slowly. I don't remember. It was just a regular shift." Whitlock leaned forward. "A regular shift, but you left the crew for nearly an hour, with no clear note. The night shift foreman recorded you leaving to resurvey the curve section. We interviewed surviving workers. No one recalls a valid reason for leaving the crew that night." Harlan clenched his hands, veins bulging, but remained silent. "Next," Whitlock said, opening a nylon evidence bag. "This is Emily's book, found in Conestoga Creek in 1963. In 1980, analysis detected industrial fabric fibers with truck engine oil. This oil type was uncommon, only found on railroad maintenance trucks." Harlan swallowed, the small sound audible to Whitlock. "In 1987, Whitlock continued, a hair was found in the book. DNA indicated male." He flipped to the next page, the 1993 DNA analysis results. In 1993, DNA matched 60% with the sample taken from you during a minor assault arrest. Technology was limited then, we couldn't conclude. Whitlock pulled out a more recent page, placing it on the table. In 2010, when you were detained in York County, we obtained a new DNA sample. This time, technology was better. The book sample matches 89% with your DNA. Would you like to explain why your hair was on the book Emily carried right before she disappeared? Harlan stared at the paper, as if it were alien. His eyes flickered for a moment, then he answered in a hoarse whisper, "Maybe I touched it while working. Maybe someone picked up the book, and it fell." Whitlock interrupted. "The book was found completely soaked in water. The hair was stuck inside, under the paper layers. It had to adhere to the book before it fell into the creek, not after." Harlan fell silent. Whitlock did not pause. He placed a Susquehannock Forest map on the table. In 2005, state simulations showed 3 viable routes if a perpetrator wanted to remove Emily from the residential area. and all three led into Susquehannock. The railroad route was optimal, and you had authority to operate trucks there. He added a geological map. In 1975, compartment 14B subsided and was filled. When we checked forestry data, it noted the area was once a pit. In 1963, the K9 unit had a weak reaction near that exact spot. Harlan stared at the map, but his expression changed little. Whitlock continued in an even but cutting tone. Do you know why that area was skipped in forestry activities between 1976 and 1977? Because the soil was deemed unstable. That's a sign of soil previously dug and refilled. And this location is on the route you could have taken alone in 1963 without detection. The air in the room felt heavy, pressing on the chest. Harlan looked down at his hands, then at the wall, then at the camera, as if searching for an escape from the next question. But Whitlock gave him no chance. Mr. Harlan, he said, his voice no longer calm, but edged with steel. In 1963, you said don't remember. In 1978, you said don't remember. In 1993, you still said don't remember. But now, we have data.
You were in Lancaster.
You drove the truck. You left the crew for nearly an hour. Emily's book has your hair. Forest terrain shows a dug pit on the route you could access, and you are the last person unable to prove where you were when the girl vanished. Harlan gripped his hands until his knuckles turned white. Whitlock stared directly at him, unblinking. Do you have anything to say about the evening of August 30th, 1963? Harlan opened his mouth. A very small sound escaped, not forming clear words. Then he shook his head slightly. No, he whispered, I don't remember. But Whitlock no longer believed that answer, and he knew, from this moment the interrogation would not just be confrontation. It would be the first step in dismantling a lie that had endured for 55 years. The next morning, when Frank Harlan was brought back to interrogation room number 3, he looked several years older than he had just one night before. His steps slower, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of years compressed between 4 walls of memory had begun to sink into his gaunt body. But Detective Aaron Whitlock didn't let those signs affect his approach. Today wasn't about revisiting vague pasts, but about piling all the new evidence onto the one weak point Harlan couldn't deny himself. As Harlan sat down, Whitlock placed a large evidence folder on the table, but this time, he didn't open it right away. He left it there, in front of Harlan like a massive rock blocking the space, forcing the other man to see it before hearing any questions. Mr. Harlan, Whitlock began, his voice even and low. Yesterday we talked about the inconsistencies in your 1963 statement. Today we're talking about evidence. Not guesses, not memory. Evidence. Harlan shifted, but stayed silent. Whitlock opened the first file, enlarged images from the 2010 DNA results showing genetic markers matching the hair sample obtained from the book. He turned the printout toward Harlan. This is your sample, and this is the sample taken from Emily's book. They match at 89%. The lab's calculation says the chance these 2 samples belong to 2 different people is less than 1 in 80,000. The air in the room went quiet for a beat. Harlan stared at the page, his eyes dull, but he showed no surprise or protest, just a heavy silence, as if every explanation had been crushed between clenched teeth. Whitlock continued. Yesterday you said maybe you touched the book, or someone picked it up through you. I'll ask one more time, and only once. Did you know Emily Lytton? Harlan shook his head. No. Did you ever see the girl that night? No. Did you ever touch any of her belongings? No. Whitlock slowly set the DNA sheet aside. So what was your DNA doing in her book? Harlan didn't answer. He moved to the second evidence bag, photos of the gray-blue fabric fibers, stained with machine oil analyzed in 1980. These fibers, Whitlock said, were found on the book's spine, in a place they couldn't have stuck if the book had simply fallen into the mud. The machine oil on them isn't household type, it's industrial truck oil. Penn Railroad confirmed that type of vehicle belonged to the rail maintenance crew. You worked for maintenance. You had access to drive that type of truck. Why were fibers from your truck in Emily's book? Harlan looked down at the table, his hands clenched so tight, his fingers trembled slightly, as if rebelling against his own body. Whitlock didn't stop. He pulled out the 2005 simulated rail route map and placed it on the table. This is the old rail line. This is the intersection where Emily was last seen. And this, he pointed to the darker forested area, is the turnout the Penn Railroad maintenance crew used in 1963. The turnout leads straight into Susquehannock. You were the only one assigned to operate the truck that night. Harlan winced. Whitlock continued, his voice sharp as a blade. In 1963, you told police you weren't sure if you drove that night. But the railroad records show you were responsible for the short patrol truck. You understand, you. No one else. You left the crew for nearly an hour without a valid reason. And that time matches exactly when Emily disappeared. Harlan ground his teeth, his lower jaw twitching slightly, as if holding back a response that wouldn't come out. Whitlock let the silence stretch, then opened the Susquehannock Forest map, the one the geology team had marked position 14B, with a red symbol. This is where the ground sank in 1975. This was the pit area in 1963. And this, he pointed to a spot a few meters away, is where the K9 unit reacted the night Emily went missing. Even though the reaction was weak, it was the only spot in the entire area where the dogs reacted. Harlan drew in a long breath, then exhaled slowly, his hands shaking more visibly. Whitlock leaned forward. Do you know why the ground sank here in 1975? Because there was a hollow space underneath. A hollow not natural. It was dug, and we know it was filled in before the rain caused the collapse. Harlan closed his eyes for a few seconds, as if hoping when he opened them the whole thing would be a mistake, a misidentification, some administrative error. But when he opened them, his gaze had changed. It no longer held the weary defiance of the day before, but something more evasive. A fear of being cornered. Whitlock noticed it, and he pushed further. Mr. Harlan, he said lightly, placing his hand on the file, we have your DNA. We have fibers from your truck. We have the route you could take. We have evidence you left the crew for nearly an hour. We have the map showing the suspicious location matches where you could have taken the victim. And we have a witness. Harlan startled. What witness? A 1963 witness, Whitlock replied, without changing his tone. The person living in the house near the intersection. She said she saw a railroad worker, thin build, wearing a dark jacket, walking near the dirt road area that night. She couldn't see the face because it was dark. But she described the gait, matching your health records from back then. Harlan wiped his hand across his face, shaking badly. Whitlock continued. I'm not saying she identified you, but I'm saying she didn't describe it wrong. He leaned back, letting a thick silence fill the room. Do you want to know what makes me believe you know what happened to Emily? Without waiting for an answer, Whitlock said, because you're the only one who can't prove where you were. The only one with matching DNA. The only one with access to the right truck. The only one with a route leading to the filled-in ground. The only one with unusual crew departure behavior. Harlan bit his lip hard, his right hand gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing holding him back before his entire past collapsed. Whitlock spoke slowly, each word like a nail driven into the air. Where were you? And what did you do on the night of August 30th? 1963. Harlan was silent. But it was no longer the silence of someone who truly didn't remember. It was the heavy silence of someone who knew exactly what awaited, if he spoke, and who also understood that silence wouldn't shield him much longer. That moment stretched like a fraying rope. The camera captured every small movement, eyelids fluttering slightly, breath catching in his chest, aged fingers digging into the table edge, until the knuckles went white. He tried to hold the silence, but silence now was no longer a shield. It was evidence of a man sitting on the edge of a precipice his past had dug for over half a century. Whitlock didn't press immediately. He opened the file, not reading, just placing the key pages in front of Harlan, one by one enlarged photo of the oil-stained fibers, the 89% DNA results, the old railroad map, the marked area 14B in Susquehannock Forest, the 1963 witness statement about the thin man walking past the intersection. His voice dropped, no longer steel-sharp, but quietly chilling. You don't have to lie anymore, Frank. In 1963, they didn't have the data. In 1975, rain covered the traces. In 1993, DNA wasn't strong enough. But today, he paused, sliding the DNA results sheet right up to Harlan's hand. Today, there's nothing left to hide. Harlan closed his eyes. A choked breath escaped his chest, long and ragged, like the crack of a door held shut for too long. He opened his eyes again, sunken, red, but no longer resisting. "I prayed," he said softly. His voice, that of someone who had given up on himself. "I thought I could take it to the grave with me." Whitlock didn't react, just let the words hang, sink, and linger between them. Harlan continued, his voice wearing thin with each syllable. I didn't mean to. It wasn't like you think." Whitlock tilted his head. "Then tell me exactly what happened that night." Harlan swallowed hard, looking down at his trembling hands. "I saw the girl walking alone. Dark road. I stopped the truck because I thought she might be in danger." Whitlock didn't respond, but his eyes were cold as sharpened steel. Harlan knew no one believed that, and he himself lacked the strength to build another cover. Then he let out a heavy breath, like someone deciding to jump when no choices remained. The girl got scared, screamed. "I just wanted her to be quiet, just wanted to hold her to explain." He stopped, hands covering his face. I didn't know how hard I pushed." Her head hit the side of the truck. The interrogation room grew a degree colder when those words came out. But Whitlock didn't interrupt. Harlan shook harder, then continued, his voice breaking. "When I carried her down from the road, she wasn't responding. I panicked. I thought if I called the police, they'd say he choked. They'd say I did it on purpose." Each sentence pulled up from the depths. "I put her in the truck. Drove into the old rail line. I knew Susquehannock Forest had turnouts no one saw at night." Whitlock placed the map in front of him. "You took this route?" Harlan nodded, slow and heavy like a hammer blow to himself. "I turned onto the trail, the section still open for trucks back then. I drove to near the old pit, where the maintenance crew had excavated clay. I knew the spot because I'd worked there myself." Whitlock asked, his voice low but sharp. "Then what did you do with Emily?" Harlan brought both hands up to his head, shoulders shaking violently, and in that moment, on camera, he looked not like a suspect trying to deflect, but like an old man slowly being swallowed by his past until he couldn't breathe. "I dug the ground, not deep. It was dark. I just wanted to hide. I just wanted no one to find." He clenched his fists. "No one to know I'd been there." Those words made Whitlock sit up straighter, because this was no longer vague or half true. This was admission. "Where did you bury her?" Whitlock asked. Harlan pointed to the map with his hand, without hesitation, without second-guessing, as if that location had never left his mind, even after 60 years. His trembling finger traced the map, then stopped exactly at position 14, the 1975 sinkhole point, the spot the geology team determined had been excavated, the spot the K9 reacted to in 1963. "Here," he whispered, "under the soil, next to the big tree root, before it sank and filled in. Right here." The interrogation room was so quiet you could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock. Whitlock didn't speak right away. He just looked at Frank Harlan as if trying to capture this historic moment. The moment Lancaster had waited over half a century for. A heavy sigh escaped Harlan's mouth. Not relief, but surrender. He said, his voice trembling as if about to shatter. "I'll show where I buried her." And with those words, over 50 years of silence, deadlock and cold case files finally cracked open, revealing the door straight to the truth buried deep in Susquehannock Forest since the summer of 1963. 3 days after the final interrogation, the day Frank Harlan admitted to burying the girl at Plot 14B in Susquehannock Forest, a special state forensic team was mobilized to the scene. It was still dark when they approached the forest, thick fog covering under the canopy, the lights from the patrol vehicles reflecting as hazy streaks through the leaves. This wasn't an ordinary search, it was a decisive excavation for a case buried for over half a century. At point 14B, yellow tape was stretched into a large circle, about 30 feet from the suspected spot to avoid disturbing the soil. A detailed map, based on Harlan's directions and prior geological data, sat on a folding metal table. Detective Aaron Whitlock stood beside the forensic team leader, both looking at the geological simulation. The layer filled in 1975, the sink lines from rainwater, the predicted hollow space 2 to 3 feet below the surface. "We'll do it, layer by layer," the team leader said, like an archaeological dig. No big shovels, just trowels, brushes, and GPR. The ground-penetrating radar was brought in first. The screen showed wavy reflection lines, clear signs of past soil disturbance. At about 40 inches deep, there was an area reflecting differently from the natural ground. "Hollow space," the technician said. "Small but clear." That was enough for the forensic team to start digging. Every layer of soil removed was sifted through screens for small objects, fabric scraps, buttons, bone fragments. The soil was softer than expected, just as prior analysis indicated, low compaction, mixed new and old particles, clear evidence of refill with different material. By the third layer, the first digger stopped. "Something here," he said. His voice lowered as if afraid to break the forest's silence. From the damp, dark soil, a small curved object emerged. Bone. No one rushed. The technician bent down, gently brushing away surrounding soil with a specialized brush. Another bone segment appeared, then another. "This is an arm bone. Juvenile," the forensic technician said quietly. The air froze for a few seconds. And then the work continued, slow but steady, layer by layer, as if they were unraveling time with their fingertips. When digging to the right about a foot, they found a small fabric scrap, light blue background, rotted but still recognizable with white edging. Whitlock recognized it immediately. The color of the Lancaster High School summer uniform from 1963, the exact type Emily wore in her last known photo. The fabric was placed in an evidence bag, labeled 14B02. Digging a few more inches deeper, they found a small round object, metallic glint under the wet soil. A technician picked it up with tweezers, a silver necklace with a faded flower pendant. In Emily's 1963 family file, it was clearly noted, Emily wore a silver flower necklace, birthday gift from mother. Whitlock closed his eyes for a second. Not from surprise, but from the painful, slow spin of time. The forensic team continued expanding the excavation area, and after just a few more trowel strokes, the skeletal structure began to emerge more clearly. Small ribs, undeveloped femurs, female pelvis. A forensic expert turned to Whitlock and nodded slightly. Juvenile female, around Emily's age when she went missing. When the ground was fully cleared around the remains, the forensic team determined the body had been buried in a fetal position, arms lightly curled into the body. This position matched Harlan's description from the interrogation. He carried her down from the truck, panicked, dug hastily, and placed her there. The soil around the remains had different coloration, consistent with manual fill, a soft layer, unevenly mixed, with tree roots and clay chunks. The deeper they dug, the clearer it was. This wasn't a natural pit. It was a grave. A bag of fragments was collected, a few very small brown hairs trapped under a cervical bone fragment, a metal uniform button, a blunt broken necklace chain. All three were sent for DNA testing that same day. When the team fully removed the remains into a specialized forensic bag, the day had turned to late afternoon. The last sunlight slid through the thick trees, turning the excavation site into a golden streaked ground, as if time was trying to illuminate what had long been hidden. Whitlock stood a few steps away, silently watching the remains bag being lifted from the pit. He said nothing, moved little, just kept his gaze on where Emily's body had lain for 55 years. In that moment, he understood what they had touched wasn't just soil and bone, but the final piece of a story trapped in the forest's darkness, buried by rain, by fear, and by memories. Harlan had tried to hide. That night, in State Lab Room 4, the bone and hair samples were run through the latest generation DNA analyzer. The results didn't take long. DNA matched 99.94% with Lytton family samples. The report concluded, remains excavated from Plot 14B, Susquehannock, belonged to Emily Lytton. Whitlock received the notification at 9:03 p.m. He set the phone down on the table, looking at the Susquehannock Forest map, marked up over months of investigation, and he knew they had found her. After over half a century, Emily had finally been brought back to the light. When the forensic report confirmed that the remains found at Plot 14B belonged to Emily Lytton, the investigation shifted to a phase that Lancaster had never imagined would arrive after 55 years, preparing an indictment against Frank Raymond Harlan. In the temporary office of the Attorney General's investigative team, Detective Aaron Whitlock and the prosecutors sat around a long table, with the entire case file, from the yellowed pages of 1963 to the latest DNA report, stacked in thick piles. Every piece of evidence, every line of text, every marked location on the map, had to be examined not only from an investigative perspective, but also under the court's standard of proof, where every piece had to form an unshakable logical structure. Lead prosecutor, Marcia Hale, opened the meeting. "We only get one shot at presenting this. Every fact must be arranged in the most logical sequence: motive, opportunity, means, act, concealment." Whitlock nodded and outlined the 5 key pieces of evidence that would become the pillars of the prosecution's case. First point: DNA. Not just the 89% match from 2010, but the full analysis rerun after the remains were found. Although the hair collected in 1987 was heavily fragmented, next-generation sequencing technology determined that the hair sample belonged to Harlan with a probability so high that it completely ruled out coincidence. The DNA report was presented in layers. 1987. Initial collection, 1993. Partial match, 2010. High match, and 2018. Confirmatory conclusion. Ultimately, DNA on Emily's necklace, a forensic discovery made shortly after the excavation, also showed trace contact from Harlan. Second point: statements. The confession in the interrogation room was not only clear in content, but matched every detail with the location where the body was found. The tree stump position, burial depth, vehicle approach direction, description of the old pit, and even how he hastily dug in the dark. The prosecutor emphasized, "We have a statement that matches the terrain and physical evidence, something that couldn't be made up if he hadn't been there." In addition to the confession, inconsistencies in his 1963 statement and evasiveness in the 2018 interrogation were treated as factors proving intent to conceal. Third point: geology. This was a new element unavailable in the 1960s, but became a legal pillar in 2018. The geological report proved the pit existed before 1963, had been dug and refilled, causing it to subside in 1975. Moreover, rainfall flow models, soil compaction, and soil structure all matched the presence of an object buried before refilling. Geology didn't name the perpetrator, but it stated clearly, the pit was man-made, not natural, and it was exactly the spot Harlan pointed out. Fourth point: physical evidence. Fragments of a light blue uniform, silver necklace with a flower pendant, brown hair strands, along with fabric pieces mixed with soil characteristic of 1963, all directly linked to Emily. The gray-blue fabric stained with industrial truck oil, found on the spine of the book recovered at Conestoga Creek, became key evidence connecting Harlan to the victim before her disappearance. The book, the only evidence from 1963, had preserved traces that technology at the time couldn't analyze. But by 2018, it became a complete legal bridge between victim and suspect. Fifth point, prior record and work history. The 1978 minor conviction wasn't directly related, but it provided the initial DNA sample that unlocked decades of subsequent analysis. His employment with Penn Railroad was opportunity evidence. Harlan was present at the right place, at the right time, driving the right type of vehicle, and authorized to use the old rail line. The route that 2005 modeling determined was the only logical abduction path to remove Emily from the residential area undetected. The 1963 timesheets and temporarily off-duty notes became crucial in proving he had unaccounted time to approach the victim. When the 5 evidence points were reassembled into a single logical chain, Prosecutor Hale concluded, "We don't just have a theory, we have convergence of 5 independent evidence groups: DNA, statements, geology, physical evidence, and work history. This is tighter than any cold case I've ever seen." Whitlock added a critical analysis. The facts not only connected, but also ruled out nearly all alternatives. No second person's DNA, no other vehicle matching witness descriptions, no other individual working near where Emily was last seen, no natural explanation for a dug and refilled pit exactly where Harlan described. The nearly 400-page indictment was completed in 3 weeks, including a summary of the 1963 events, a timeline of the decades-long investigation, DNA comparison charts, excavation site photos, Susquehannock Forest maps, route simulations, and all of Harlan's interrogation statements. Every page was reviewed at 3 levels: investigation, forensics, prosecution. In the end, the Attorney General approved the indictment on 3 charges: kidnapping, felony murder, and concealment of a body. When the red seal was stamped on the first page, the Emily Lytton file, the case once thought destined to remain forever in a cold storage cabinet, officially entered the final chapter of its 60-year journey, bringing the truth before justice. The trial of Frank Raymond Harlan was scheduled for early March 2019 at the Lancaster County Courthouse, in the historic courtroom, with its dark wood domed ceiling and time-worn long benches. The man who had kept the investigation in limbo for 6 decades entered the room with a slow shuffle, his vacant eyes staring straight ahead, hands loosely cuffed to accommodate his age over 70. Though elderly, his appearance silenced the courtroom completely, not out of fear, but from the weight of awaiting an answer buried for nearly a century. The jury of 12 was carefully selected and instructed that this was both a crime from the past and a test of modern science's ability to resurrect truth. Prosecutor Marcia Hale began, "The law does not forget. Time does not erase, and science does not lie." The entire room shifted slightly, a sign that every eye, every focus was drawn to the trial's center. Hale outlined the basics. Emily Lytton, 15 years old, disappeared in 1963. The case went cold. DNA, geology, physical evidence, and current statements now formed a complete logical chain. She avoided emotion or family tragedy. Instead, she stressed, "We are here to judge based on evidence, not memory." Harlan's defense attorney opened with the familiar argument for cold cases: too much time has passed, memories fade, evidence can be contaminated, circumstances are uncertain. But as he spoke, the prosecution's arsenal was already prepared behind him. Geology-based maps, next-generation DNA, excavated evidence, and the videotaped confession. When the evidence presentation began, Whitlock was the first called. He stood before the jury, detailing the 6-year journey of reconstructing the case from digitized foundations. He kept it concise, short, clear, weighty sentences. He pointed to the enlarged railroad route map on the easel. "This is the route Harlan maintained. This is the intersection where Emily was last seen. This is the turnoff only railroad workers knew." Then he pointed to another map from the geological report. "This is the pit that existed before 1963. This is where it subsided abnormally in 1975. And this is where we found Emily." Each map, each arrow, Each marked line didn't just illustrate. They served as links in the prosecution's chain: opportunity, means, route, location. When Whitlock reached the Harlan interrogation, the defense immediately objected, claiming the confession was involuntary. But the prosecution played the video: Harlan uncoerced, unthreatened, fully lucid, and especially describing the burial site in details matching the actual location. The jury sat motionless. Next, the DNA expert took the stand. She placed a large comparison chart before the jury, divided into 4 analysis phases: 1987, 1993, 2010, and 2018. She explained DNA fragmentation mechanisms in water and mud conditions, why the hair in the book could still be sequenced, and why the 89% match wasn't just high, but sufficient to exclude anyone else. This isn't coincidence. This is direct trace from Harlan. The defense asked if the hair could have adhered to the book after Emily's disappearance. The expert replied immediately, impossible. The hair's position was under fully soaked paper layers. It had to be in the book before water contact. Some jurors nodded slightly, the lines of reasoning sharpening in their minds. For the geology expert's presentation, courtroom lights were dimmed to project the Susquehannock terrain simulation from 1963, 2018. The expert explained in simple but precise terms signs of dug soil, low compaction, abnormal post-1975 rain soil shifts, and how the void formed a reflection pattern on ground-penetrating radar. Nature doesn't create a void exactly where Harlan described. A person did. One juror asked, could someone else have dug the pit? The expert replied, possible. But the access route to the pit was one only Penn Railroad personnel used, abandoned by late 1963. There's no evidence anyone else had reason to go there. Following geology came the excavation forensics team. They presented site photos, light blue uniform fragments, metal buttons, silver flower pendant necklace, juvenile skeletal structure, and burial characteristics matching Harlan's statement: depth, position, orientation. One forensic technician pointed to the necklace photo, unmistakable. This matches the family's description, and Emily's DNA on it is a perfect match. The defense tried to downplay it with suggestions of mix-up. After over 50 years, how can you be sure this isn't someone else's remains? The lead forensic pathologist replied succinctly, because the DNA matches 99.94% with the Lytton family, and because the location matches the defendant's statement. Science doesn't guess. When reaching the 1963 evidence, the book found by the creek, a trace analyst placed it in a glass case and detailed its journey over half a century. This book contains 3 types of traces: Harlan's hair, industrial fabric fibers, and soil matching the burial pit. Each independently reinforces the same conclusion. The jury was silent, but their eyes no longer confused. They were now following a complete, seamless evidence structure. Finally, the prosecution projected the simulated route Harlan took on the night of August 30th, 1963, starting from the rail area, turning onto a maintenance-only trail, then straight to Pit 14B. No outsider knew this route. No outsider could drive an industrial truck here, only him. Hale concluded, the evidence doesn't just point to the defendant. It interlocks into a system: DNA, physical evidence, soil, route, work schedule, confession, geology. No piece stands alone. Each supports the others, and all lead to Frank Harlan. When Harlan was called to respond, he only said, I don't remember. But it wasn't the jury listening to him. They were listening to science, terrain, evidence, and his own recorded confession. And then, as the presentation ended, the courtroom was no longer a place of doubt, but one where truth had filled every space, leaving no room for anything else. As the trial concluded with closing arguments from both sides, the atmosphere in the Lancaster courtroom grew heavy as lead, silent enough that the clerk's page-turning echoed clearly. The jury deliberated for nearly 5 hours behind closed doors. 5 hours that, for those who had followed the case from the start, felt like 50 years. When they returned, faces expressionless, every eye in the room turned to the foreperson. We are unanimous, he said. voice steady but slightly lowered by the weight of the verdict. Defendant Frank Raymond Harlan, guilty on all counts. The room didn't erupt in cheers or sighs, only a spreading silence, the quiet of truth landing exactly where it belonged. Harlan showed no reaction beyond closing his eyes for a long time, as if he had foreseen this moment years ago, but still hoped time would bury it. Judge Keller looked down at the defendant, voice stern but not angry. "Mr. Harlan, the court considers not only your actions in 1963, but the 60 years you let the truth remain buried. 15-year-old Emily Lytton deserved to come home. You took that away, and for decades you chose silence, leaving her family in doubt, letting justice stall." He paused, then pronounced sentence. The court sentences Frank Raymond Harlan to life imprisonment without parole, on the charges of kidnapping, felony murder, and concealment of a body. You will serve at Green State Correctional Institution, with no possibility of reduction. When the gavel struck the bench, the sound marked the end of a 60-year fracture in Lancaster's history. Harlan was led away immediately, his steps heavy, but no longer trembling as in the interrogation room. He knew what awaited behind those doors, and he no longer had the strength to resist. As the courtroom emptied, Detective Aaron Whitlock stood near the door, the Susquehannock Forest map he had carried through every presentation still in hand. A court officer approached and said quietly, "You brought the girl home." Whitlock didn't reply at once. He looked at the empty back benches where the Lytton family had sat through hearings, holding Emily's faded photo, and only then answered, "No one could bring her home. We just brought the truth back." That afternoon, in the temporary office, Whitlock opened the Emily Lytton file one last time. The thick hundreds of pages dossier contained time-yellowed documents, freshly printed photos, creased maps from heavy use, and Harlan's recorded confession transcript. He signed the final entry in the system, "Case status, closed, offender convicted." When the cursor clicked confirm, the screen displayed the words the entire Lancaster Police Department had waited over half a century for: the Emily Lytton case, officially closed. No applause, no jostling reporters, no dramatic scenes, just the quiet of a file finally reaching its proper end. Whitlock carefully returned the documents to the black storage box, stood, and closed the lid. He placed his hand on the label, where Lytton, Emily, 1963, had faded over the years, and whispered just loud enough for himself, "We found you, and now you can rest." The box was taken to archives and placed on the top shelf, not because it was old, but because it was complete. In Lancaster, people say that afternoon, the Susquehannock Forest stood unusually still, as if the woods themselves sensed that the secret hidden in its soil for 6 decades had finally been brought to light. And in one corner of Pennsylvania, justice, though late, had arrived in full. The story of the Emily Lytton case, a 1963 disappearance solved after 56 years through DNA, geological analysis, and the persistence of investigators, is not just a journey for justice, but also a reflection of many practical issues in American life today. Looking back at the key details, from the book dropped by the creek, the oil-stained fabric, the fragmented hair sample, to the refilled pit in Susquehannock Forest, we see one clear truth: the truth doesn't return on its own. It requires people with enough perseverance and a society that values scientific progress and community responsibility. In America today, where missing persons rates remain high, especially for minors and women, Emily's story reminds us that a disappearance is never over. If 1963 lacked DNA technology, if 1975 had no subsidence report, if 2018 had no digitization and case reopening decision, the truth would forever lie under Pennsylvania forest soil. This sends an important lesson to every family: preserve information, document details, and don't hesitate to update or resubmit data to authorities as technology advances. Small items like jewelry, hair samples, or medical records, like Emily's silver necklace, can become irreplaceable evidence over time. At the same time, The story underscores community responsibility in reporting suspicious behavior, as the 1963 witness, who saw a thin railroad worker, inadvertently provided a crucial piece, even though no one knew its value then. And finally, Detective Whitlock's persistence shows us that in the United States, where the legal system can be slow but always aims for justice, every effort can yield results, even after 56 years. The greatest lesson: no missing persons case is too old to seek the truth, and no pain is too late to heal. Thank you for following the journey to restore justice for Emily Lytton after 56 years. If you find stories like this meaningful, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss cases unraveled by truth and science. See you in the next video, where we continue to illuminate mysteries long thought buried by time.